Thank you very much.
الحاضرين جميعا تحية
Thank you very much
طيبة
for being
أينما
here with us
كنتم
today.
جميعا. شكرا لكم جميعا على الحضور
I thank you for your time
ومشاركة هذه
and for
الفعالية اليوم والتي
participating in
بعنوان
this event today,
العدالة
an
الانتقالية
event under
وحماية
the title
عمل
of
المجتمع
Transitional
المدني
Justice and the
تأملات
Protection
بعد
of Civil
مرور عام
Society,
على إطلاق إعلان اليمن
Reflections
بالعدالة
on the first
والمصالحة.
anniversary of the Yemen
كما اسمحوا لي أن
Declaration for
أرحب
Justice and
بضيوف
Reconciliation. I would
ضيوفنا
also
في هذا
like to
اليوم
welcome
كلا
our
من
dear
الأستاذة ميسة
panelists
شجاع
today,
الدين
Ms. Mesa
باحثة عضو في مركز
Shuja'ad-Din,
صنعاء
a
للدراسات
senior researcher
الاستراتيجية،
at the Sana'a Center for
والأستاذة هدى
Strategic
الصراري
Studies,
محامية
Ms. Huda
ورئيسة
Sarari,
مؤسسة
a
الدفاع عن
lawyer and the
الحقوق
head of the
والحريات،
Difa' Foundation
والأستاذة نيكو
for Rights and Freedoms,
جعفرينيا
Miss
باحثة في
Mrs.
قسم
Nico
الشرق الأوسط والشمال
Jafarnia, who is
أفريقيا
a researcher
بمنظمة
at
Human
the
Rights
Middle
Watch،
East and North
والأستاذ
Africa
مهدي بالغيث
Department at
الناشط
Human Rights Watch,
الحقوقي
and Mahdi
ورئيس منظمة
Belghaith, a rights
مساءلة.
activist and the head of the Musa'ala
السادة والسيدات
Foundation.
المتحدثون هم شخصيات معروفة من
Our
الناشطين
panelists are
والعاملين
well-known
يعرفهم
activists and
المهتمين بالشأن
practitioners
اليمني عموما
who are
والعمل
well-known to
والمجال
anyone who's
الحقوقي
paying
خاصة.
attention to
ما يعني
Yemen,
أنه لم يتبقى سوى
especially
التعريف
in the rights
بمحدثي
field.
ميسر هذه الجلسة. أنا
I
محمد
am
الشويطر،
Mohammed Shuwaitar.
استشاري بملف العدالة
I am
بمركز
a
صنعاء.
consultant at
ندوة
on
اليوم
the
هي
rights
تغطي
file at the
محورين
Sana'a
أساسيين.
Center. Our
الأول هو
seminar today
العدالة
will focus on
الانتقالية
two
عقب
main issues. The
مرور
first is transitional
عام
justice
منذ إعلانه في 26
a year
يوليو من العام
into
الماضي،
the
والذي وقعته
declaration,
أكثر من
the Yemen
26 منظمة
Declaration, and a
حقوقية
declaration that was
ومدنية
signed by more than
طالبت
26
فيه
rights
بضرورة
and civil
اعتماد
society organizations
مجموعة من
in which they
القواعد
called for
لتكون
the
حاضرة
importance
في أي اتفاق سلم
of including
لضمان
several
سلام
core
دائم وعادل
principles to ensure that
شامل.
any peace settlement is
المحور الثاني
comprehensive
سيكون
and is
حول
sustainable.
حملة
The second part
الاعتقالات
of our
التي
discussion
طالت
today will be
العديد
on
من
the arrest
الناشطين
campaign that has
والعاملين في
affected
المنظمات
many
المدنية
activists
في
and
مناطق
staff of
سيطرة
civil society
سلطة صنعاء.
organizations in the areas under
قبل
the
أن
control of the
أبدأ
Sana'a
أنوه أنه سيكون
authorities.
هناك مجال
Before we
للأسئلة
start, I would
في
like to let
نهاية
everyone know
الحوار،
that we will have some time for
وأتمنى من
questions and answers at the end of our discussion.
المشاركين أو
And I hope that
المتحدثين أن تتسع صدورهم
that the
لأسئلتي ذات
panelists
اليوم.
can be here or can
نبدأ
forgive me
بأول
for my
الأسئلة
excessive
حول
questioning
ملف
during
العدالة.
our
سنبدأ
talk today.
أول
We'll
هذا
start
المحاور
with
حول ملف العدالة
the first
الانتقالية
topic, the
بعد مرور
topic of
عام
the
على
Transitional
إعلان
Justice File a
إعلان
year
العدالة
into
والمصالحة.
or a year after the
أبدأ
launch
معك
of the
أستاذة
declaration. I
ميسا.
would like to
أولا
start
أهلا
with
وسهلا
Mesa.
بك.
Welcome to this
بعد
webinar.
عام من هذا الإعلان وأنا
As
أعلم
a
أنك
year
عملت
into the declaration, I know
وضعت
that
جهد كبير حول هذا
you've
الإعلان.
put a lot of effort
لماذا هذا
into
الإعلان، إعلان العدالة
achieving and
والمصالحة
accomplishing this
لليمن،
declaration.
وما هي
And so my question
أولويته
is
في
why?
المرحلة
And
الحالية
why is
من
it a
وجهة نظرك؟
priority at this time from your perspective?
أهلا بالجميع وأهلا فيك محمد.
Hello,
شاكرة
everyone.
لكم
Thank you
على
very much, Mohammed.
استضافتكم لهذا البانل.
Thank you for
شكرا
hosting
لمركز
this.
صنعاء
I would
استضافة
like
هذا
to thank the
البانل
Sanaa
بطبيعة
Center for
الحال،
hosting this
وشاكرة
panel, and thank you
لإدارتها
for facilitating it.
ولجميع الحاضرين
I'd also like to
والمتواجدين.
thank all of the
بخصوص
other panelists and the
البيان،
attendees
هو
for being
كان
here. With regards to the
الهدف
declaration,
إنه من بداية الحرب
the
كانت
idea was that
الجهود
since the
منظمات
beginning of
المجتمع
the
المدني
war, the
اليمنية
efforts of Yemeni civil
بشتى أنحت
society
كبير،
organizations had been very
وتحتاجت إلى
fragmented
التنسيق
and
ووضوح
were not
أمام
sufficiently
المجتمع الدولي
coordinated and were
وأمام
not
المجتمع
clear to
اليمني
the international
فيما
community
يبدو
or the
أنه
Yemeni
تجاهل لمطلب
society.
العدالة الانتقالية.
And
في
it seemed
الحال
like
في
this was a
كان
part
أمل
of
جيد جدا
uh,
وممتاز على مستوى
a
التوثيق
part of a tendency to
على
ignore the issue
مستوى
of transitional
المقاربة
justice. There were
والمساعدة.
efforts to document,
أحيانا بعض
and
الجماعات
there were
تطالب
some demands
بتعويضات
for
وأحيانا تنجح
accountability.
هذه
Some
المطالب،
groups would
لكنها كانت
demand,
نادرة
for
جدا.
example, compensation or
فهذا كله
reparations,
كان
and
محتاج
very
إلى شيء
rarely
من
would they
أشياء
succeed.
التنسيق.
And so we
كان
believed
هذا
that there
الهدف من
was a
البيان
need for better
هو
coordination, and
سرد
this was the objective of the
أو يعني
declaration
إصدار عمل
to
يبدو فيه واضحا حالة
work on something
تنسيق
that
ما
makes
بين
it
المنظمات
very
المختلفة
clear
اليمنية
or leads to a clear
تطالب فيه
state of
بالعدالة الدولية.
coordination between the Yemeni
هنا
organizations and in which
حتوضح
they
شيء
demand
انه في
justice. I would like to
2011
clarify
عندما
something here. In
حدثت
2011,
الانتفاضة 2011 كان
when
هناك
the
مطالب
2011 uprising
بالمساءلة
started,
والعدالة
there were
الانتقالية.
demands for
كانت هذه
accountability
المطالب
and
هي
transitional
نتيجة
justice, and
لعمل
these
منظمات
demands
المجتمع
were a result
المدني
of the
اليمنية
activities of
بدءا
Yemen
من
civil
منتصف
society
2000
organizations, which
العشرية الأولى
started
في
working on this
الألفية
process in the
بعد
mid
الألفين.
2000s.
هذه المطالب كانت بدأت بالتحديد
And the demands at that
المطالب
time,
كانت متعلقة
they were
بالإعفاء
primarily
النسوي
linked to the cases of
وتجمعات
enforced
الأسر
disappearance,
اللي هي
and the
عانوا من
families that
الإعفاء
had
الجسدي.
suffered from these violations came
وكان هذا
together
بداية
and
حراك
demanded
الحكومة في
accountability. And this
توجيه
was
جهود
the
الضحايا
first
وأسر
attempt
الضحايا
of victims'
واللي
unions,
كانت أيضا
victims'
بعض
families,
الصحف وتحديدا
and
صحف
also
الرسالة على القول الأساسي
news
فجاء
outlets like the
التحقيق
Nida
2011
newspaper played a
أيضا
role in that. And
كرست
so in
وتوجت
2011,
بالجنوب كرستها.
there was a
وهذا
culmination of these
المقهى في
efforts
فكرة
to
إنه
demand
المبعوث
accountability.
الأممي جمال بن
And
عمر
this laid the
وضعها كما
groundwork for the
أولويات،
idea of the
لأنه
UN Special
المجتمع
Envoy
الدولي
Jamal bin Umar at the
والجهود
time
الدولية
putting this as
والعادة
one of its
الأممية
priorities,
بتيجي
because usually
بتوج نضالات الناس
international efforts
اليمنيين ومطالبهم
come
وبيعبر
to
عنها.
support the
فبالتالي إذا أنت
demands of
لم
the
أخفقت في
local
إنك
population,
تقدم
which were
مطالبك
the demand of
لن
Yemenis.
يضعها أحد
And
في
so if
أجندة
you fail
المفاوضات،
to present these
وهذا الذي
demands,
حدث
no one will
في
include them in
كل
the
جولات
negotiations
المفاوضات
agenda. And this is actually what
من
occurred
جولة
in all of the
المفاوضات في
rounds of
جنيف
talks,
واحد
starting
اثنين
from Geneva, the
ثم
first
الكويت
and
ثم
second rounds of
ستوكهولم،
talks, then
كان
the
في
Kuwait
صراع
talks, then the
كلي ما
Stockholm
بين الناس
negotiations. All of these demands were not
مطالبهم
included.
المختلفة.
The various
الوضع
demands,
طبعا
not just
ازدهر في
transitional
تويتر خلال
justice.
السنة الماضية،
And the situation
وهذا أمر
deteriorated sharply over the
ينبه أيضا
past year.
مجددا لأهمية
And I
التنسيق
think
بين منظمات
this
المجتمع
shows us the
المدني
importance of
واليمنية
coordination
وكيفية
between
إنها
Yemen civil
تمارس
society
الضغط
organizations
وتظل
and
تنسق
how they
معهم
can try to
لممارسة
pressure and
الضغوط على
continue to coordinate amongst
المجتمع
themselves
الدولي وعلى
to pressure
الأطراف
both the
المحلية
international
المختلفة داخل
community
اليمن.
and the various
وهذا لا يمكن أن
local
يتأخر إلا
actors.
بمزيد من التنسيق ومزيد
And
من
this can only be
الضغط،
done through
لأن
further
المنظمة
coordination
واحدة
and
لوحدها
further
لا
pressure, because a
تكفي.
single
يجب
organization
أنها
on its
تمارس
own
الضغط
would not be
الكافي
sufficient
للوصول للمطالب المرجوة من هذه
to
المسألة،
actually
خاصة وأن
achieve
نحن
these
بنواجه
demands
وضع
through the
خطير
use
في
of pressure
مناطق
and leverage,
سيطرة
especially
الحوثي.
since we're facing a very
هناك
dangerous
الضفة
situation in the
الأمنية
areas under the
ازدادت
control of the
وقتها.
Houthis. The
هناك شكل من
police
أشكال
state
التوحش
has gotten even
المسلوق.
more pervasive. The
هذا
treatment of civil
الأمر
society
أخشى
has only
أنه
gotten more brutal.
يصبح كالعدوى
And I
وينتقل
fear that
لمناطق
this will become contagious and will spread to other areas as well.
شكرا.
Thank you. Back
شكرا
to you,
أستاذة
Mohammed. Thank you
ميساء
very much, Mesa.
لهذه المقدمة حول
Thank you for
أهمية
this introduction
الإعلان
on the
والمرحلة
importance
التي
of the
مر
declaration,
فيها
the importance of these demands,
كخطوة من خطوات
and how the
المجتمع
process
المدني نحو العدالة
has gone
الانتقالية
through
أو
with
تحقيق
these
حد
demands or
من
efforts towards
العدالة
achieving transitional
للضحايا.
justice
أستاذ
or some
مهدي،
form
أنت
of
ممن
justice for the
تابع
victims.
وممن وقع على هذا الإعلان،
Mehdi, you were one of
كيف
the
تجد مواطنة بهذا
organizations who
الإعلان
participated and
على
signed
المستوى
the declaration.
المحلي أو
What is
ردود
your
الفعل
perspective
التي
on the
وجدتها
declaration
ضد
at
هذا
the
الإعلان من
local level, and
المنظمات
also what are
المحلية أو
some
الدولية؟
responses from local or
مرحبا أخي
international
محمد
organizations to the launch of the
ومرحبا
declaration?
بالزملاء
Thank you very much,
والموجودين
Mohammed. I would like to say
شاكر
hi
لكم
to
هذه
all of my
الوصية.
colleagues on the
صراحة
panel and the
إعلان اليمن
attendees for being
للعدالة
here.
والمصالحة
The
كان
Yemen Declaration
خطوة
for
جريئة
Justice and
ومهمة في
Reconciliation
مسار
was a very
السعي
audacious
نحو
and
تحقيق
important
السلام
step in
والاستقرار في
order to
اليمن.
achieve peace and
جاء
stability
البيان
in
في
the country.
توقيت حرج
The
كان
declaration
اليمن
came at a
يعاني
very
من
difficult
تداعيات
time.
صراع
At the
طويل
time,
محمد، وكان
Yemen had been
بحاجة
going through a very
ماسة إلى
long-running
مبادرة
conflict,
شاملة تهدف إلى رأب
and we
الصدع
needed a
وبناء الثقة بين
comprehensive
الأطراف المختلفة.
initiative that will help to
تقديري
try to
للبيان أنه كان
bridge the
محاولة
gap between the
صادقة
various
ومبنية
actors.
على
I think it
وعي
was a very
طيب
important
لتحقيق
initiative,
تحول
one
نوعي
that
في
was
المسار
well
السياسي
intentioned in order to
والاجتماعي في
achieve
البلاد.
progress in both the
على
political
المستوى
and social
المحلي كانت
tracks. At
ردود
the local
الفعل
level,
تجاه البيان
the
متنوعة.
response towards the declaration
رحب
were the
العديد من
responses were
الأطراف
very
والمكونات
diverse towards the
الاجتماعية
declaration. There were many
والسياسية في
social
الإعلام
components
باعتبار
and groups
خطوة
who
نحو
welcomed the
بناء
declaration,
جسور
seeing it
الثقة
as a
وتجاوز
step
الانقسامات
towards
التي
confidence
طال
building
أمدها.
and helping
كذلك بعض
bridge
الدول رأت في
the
الإعلان فرصة
fragmentation and
سانحة
divisions.
لإعادة
Others
توجيه
also
الحوار
saw the
الوطني
declaration as an
نحو
important
المصالحة
opportunity
الحقيقية
to
وتعزيز
redirect, to
التفاهم بين
refocus
مختلف
the national
مكونات المجتمع
dialogue
اليمني.
towards transitional
ومع ذلك
justice and
كانت هناك
reconciliation.
تحفظات من بعض
There
الأطراف
are
التي
also
اعتبرت
some
أن البيان لم
reservations
يكن
from some
شاملا
actors
بما
who
يكفي
believed that
أو
the
أنه
declaration
لم
was not
يعالج
as
بعض القضايا
comprehensive as it should
الحساسة
have been,
بشكل
or that it
مطلوب
did not
مما
resolve or
دفعها إلى
deal with
التعامل
certain
معه
sensitive
بحذر.
issues as it should have, and
إقليميا
so they
كان
dealt with
هناك
it
اهتمام
cautiously.
كبير
At the
بالإعلام
regional level, there was
خاصة
also a
من
lot of
الدول التي
focus
لها
on
دور
the
مؤثر في
declaration,
النزاع
especially by
اليمني.
the countries who
بعض
have played an
الدول اعتبرت
influential role
البيان
in the Yemeni
بمثابة
conflict.
محاولة
Some
جديدة
countries, for
لإعادة توجيه
example,
الأزمة نحو الحل
saw
السلمي
this as
وتعاملت معه
another attempt to
بإيجابية،
redirect
بينما
the
كانت هناك
crisis
دول
towards
أخرى
a settlement, and
أكثر
so they dealt with it
تحفظا
positively, whereas
ربما
other
لاعتبارات
regional
تتعلق
actors had
بمصالحها
their own
السياسية
reservations,
أو
either due
لرؤيتها
to
أن
their own
البيان قد لا
political
يكفي
considerations
تطلعاتها فيما
or the
يتعلق
belief
بالحل
that the
النهائي
declaration might
للأزمة في
not meet
اليمن.
their aspirations for what a
أما
final
بالنسبة
solution would look like in
لإسحاب
the
بعض
crisis in Yemen.
المنظمات
With regards to some of the organizations
اسمها من
withdrawing
الإعلام فهناك
their
عدة
signing
أسباب محتملة،
after the
لذلك أولا
declaration, I
بعض
think there are several
المنظمات قد تكون
reasons for
تعتبر
that.
أن
Some
الإعلان لا يعكس
organizations
بشكل
might have
كامل
felt that the
تطلعات الفئات
declaration
التي
did not fully reflect the aspirations of the groups that they represent or their constituents, especially when it comes to sensitive issues like human rights and accountability for violations. There are also organizations that might be worried about politicizing this process or the possibility of the declaration being used to achieve political objectives at the expense of real reconciliation and justice. Third reason is that some of these organizations might not be fully confident in the implementing mechanisms, or that the organizations overseeing it might not be sufficient for it to
شكرا لك
to
أستاذ
succeed on the
مهدي
ground.
في هذا
Thank you very
التوضيح.
much, Mahdi, for this
هناك
clarification.
بالفعل بلا شك
There
تباينت
have been
حول
differing
العدالة
responses to
والمصالحة
the
ما بين إما
declaration,
مؤيد أو متحفظ.
with some
ربما
supporting and
سنعود إلى
others
سؤال
having
لاحق إلى
reservations.
أي
This
مدى
will,
هذه
in a later question,
التفاعل
we'll come
كان
back
محصورا
to
على
what extent
المنظمات أو النقب أو أنه
this
وصل
response was
هذا
limited just to
الإعلان
the organizations and elites working in
إلى
this field,
عامة
or has the
الناس.
declaration
لكن
actually been
أعود أسألك
discussed
أستاذة هدى،
in public
وأنت أيضا
discourse?
ممن
Going
شارك
back
وتفاعل
to
مع
Huda
موضوع
Sarari, you
مع
were also
الإعلان ووقع
another,
عليه. ما زال
your
ربما
organization
الكثير لا
also
يعرف ما هي المبادئ
engaged with it. I
التي
think a lot of people still
دفعت
do not know what
المنظمات
were the
للتوقيع عليه. بالنسبة لك
principles
ما
that
هي أهم
encouraged or pushed
المضامين التي
organizations to sign the
جعلتك توقعي
declaration. For
وتتفاعلي
you, for
مع
your organization,
الإعلان؟
what was the substance in the declaration
بداية
that encouraged you to sign
حياكم
it?
الله جميعا
Thank you very much,
وأشكر
Muhammad. I would
منتدى
like to start
صنعاء
by thanking the Sana'a Center
الاستراتيجي على إتاحة هذا
for giving us
الاجتماع
this
للتكلم حول
opportunity and giving us this
إعلان
platform
العدالة والمصالحة الاجتماعية
to
وأهمية
discuss the
التنسيق بين
importance of
المجتمع
transitional
المدني في
justice,
اليمن مع
reconciliation, as well as the
المجتمع
importance
الإقليمي أيضا
of
والمنظمات الدولية.
coordination within local civil society
بالنسبة
organizations and
لإعلان
between them and
العدالة
regional and
والمصالحة
international
في اليمن
organizations. With
بداية
regards to
هي
the
مبادرة
declaration,
إنسانية
this
هامة
was
تسعى
a
إلى
very
معالجة
important
الجروح
humanitarian
العميقة
initiative
التي
that
خلفها
attempts to
الصراع في
deal with the
اليمن.
very deep
كذلك
wounds
أيضا
left
توفير
behind by or caused by
مسار
the
نحو
conflict in Yemen.
مستقبل
It also
أفضل.
provides a
بالتالي
path
هناك
to a better
منظومة من
future.
المبادئ التي
And
دفعتني
so there are several
إلى
principles or values
التوقيع على
that
هذه
encouraged us
المبادرة
to
هي
sign this initiative. And
من
these
حق كل
principles
فرد أن
include the
يحصل
fact
على
that
العدالة
every
وبالذات
individual
العدالة
has the right to
العناية
justice,
خاصة
especially
للضحايا الذين
criminal justice,
ارتكبت
and
في
especially
حقهم
for the
انتهاكات
victims
وجرائم
who have been subject
خلال
to
فترة الصراع
violations and
المسلح وما زالت
crimes
حتى اللحظة.
during the period of armed
أن يتم
conflict and
محاسبة
continue to be
مرتكبي
subject to these
الانتهاكات.
violations, that
أيضا يجب
those
الكشف عن الحقيقة
perpetrating the
الكاملة
violations be held
حول
accountable,
الانتهاكات التي وقعت من
and
كل الأطراف في اليمن حتى
that the
يتمكن
truth of all
الضحايا
of
من
these
الحصول
violations
على
be reached,
التعويض
so that victims are
الذي
able to get
يعني
the
يقدر
necessary
سعرهم.
reparations.
بداية أيضا التعويض عن الخسائر
It
التي
was also
حدثت
important for there to
للضحايا،
be a
وأعتقد أنه
compensation for the
المجتمع اليمني
losses
وكل
of
اليمنيين
the victims.
تعرضوا
And I think that the
لخسائر
Yemeni
إما في
society and all
الأرواح أو في
Yemenis
ممتلكات
have
أو
lost
مصادرة
something due to this
حقوقهم
conflict,
والتضييق عليهم
either
في
their
جميع الجهات،
lives, their loved
الحريات،
ones,
حتى
their
مسألة
rights and
النقد
freedoms
صارت
being
في اليمن
curbed,
مخوفة بالمخاطر.
and
منظمات
many other
المجتمع
risks.
المدني
Civil
أصبحت
society
تعمل في
organizations in
مساحة
Yemen
ضيقة جدا
operate
من
in a very limited
الحريات.
space, one that
أيضا
has
مسألة
restricted their
الحياة
freedoms,
أو
their
الحق في الحياة
activities,
الكريمة يجب بناء مستقبل
and also the
مستدام
right to a
آمن يضمن
dignified
حقوق
life, the
الإنسان
importance of
والحريات
building towards
الأساسية
something sustainable that is
لجميع
safe, that
اليمنيين
guarantees basic rights and
وجميع أيضا
freedoms to all
المواطنين في كل
Yemenis
المناطق الجغرافية في اليمن.
in all
بالتالي
parts of
كانت
the country.
هناك ردود فعل غاضبة قد
There
تثار
were
حول
some
هذا الإعلان.
responses that were
أعتقد
angry with
أنا
the declaration,
أتفهم مسألة خوف
and I
الأطراف
think I
أطراف الصراع
understand
من إعلان
the
العدالة
the
والمصالحة، لكن لا
reservations that some of
أتفهم
the actors or parties to
قلق
the
وخوف
conflict would
المجتمع
have about
المدني
the
ومنظمات
declaration, but I
المجتمع
do not
اليمني مع
understand
هذا الإعلان،
the
وهي
concern and reservations of civil
تسعى في
society
الأساس إلى رأب
organizations,
أوضاع
because
الصراع
at
في
the end of the
اليمن
day, the
وأيضا
declaration
التخفيف
attempts
من حدة الصراع.
to overcome the
بالتالي كان
differences
هناك
and
خوف
divisions
من
in Yemen and to
التغيير.
mitigate
قد
the
يخشى
impacts of
البعض
the
أن تؤدي
conflict.
عملية المصالحة
This
إلى
might be due
تغييرات
to the fact
جوهرية
that
في
some are
الوضع
afraid of
القائم مما
change. They
يهدد
believe that
مصالحهم. كانت هناك
reconciliation,
أيضا
transitional
عدم
justice might
الثقة.
threaten their interests.
البعض
There's
قد
also the
يشكك
lack
في إمكانية
of
تحقيق
trust or confidence in some
المصالحة
cases.
الحقيقية خاصة
Some
بعد
people might
سنوات
doubt
طويلة
the
من
possibility
الصراع
of actually
والانتهاكات
implementing
التي ارتكبت
transitional justice after the
بحق
many
اليمنيين
long
في
years of
كل أنحاء اليمن.
violations and
كانت هناك
abuses
أيضا
committed against
اختلاف
Yemenis in all
في
parts of the
الرؤى. قد
country.
يكون هناك
There are also
اختلاف
some
في
differences
كيفية
in the
تحقيق
perspective or the
العدالة
visions on how
والمصالحة مما
exactly to
يؤدي إلى
achieve
صراعات حول
justice and
طبيعة الحلول
reconciliation, and this led
المقترحة. أيضا
to disputes or
كانت هناك
debates
كذلك
on what
تأثيرات
proposed
خارجية، يعني
solutions were
هناك بعض
optimal. There were
الأطراف
also some
الخارجية
there was
حاولت
also
التأثير
external
على الرأي
interventions. There
العام
were
اليمني
external
والتأثير
actors
أيضا
that
على
tried to
الأطراف
affect Yemeni public
السياسية
opinion and to
المحلية وأطراف
influence it
الصراع
and to
بالذات،
influence Yemeni
وإثارة
political
الخلاف حول
actors and
هذه
parties to the
القضايا.
conflict
وبالتالي
on
أعلن
these specific issues, the issues
تجاوز
of justice and
هذه
reconciliation. And
التحديات،
so it's
وعلى جميع
important for us
الأطراف
to overcome these
اليمنية العمل
difficulties,
معا لبناء
and all
الثقة
Yemeni actors must work
وتعزيز أيضا
together to build
الحوار والتوصل
confidence
إلى
amongst
حلول
themselves,
توافقية.
to work through
يجب أيضا
dialogue
على
to reach
المجتمع الدولي تقديم
consensual
كل الدعم
solutions. The
اللازم لليمن
international
في هذه
community must also
المرحلة
provide all necessary support to Yemen during this very difficult period to achieve justice and reconciliation in the country.
شكرا أستاذة
Thank you very much, Huda.
ما تكلمتي عنه عن
what you spoke about the response and the engagement of local organizations and their responses, I think, is a very important or core point, because we are talking about local organizations. But now we'll hear from Nico about the response of international rights organizations operating in Yemen, and you're obviously working with Human Rights Watch, an organization focused on the field of human rights. How have you, or how did you see this declaration helping advance the work that you are doing in documenting human rights and human rights violations? And I think we've all seen that in Yemen, this is a file that has not really been focused on by the international community, specifically the United Nations, unlike, for example, in Syria or Libya, where transitional justice has more of a presence and is seen as more of a priority in the activities of the UN Special Envoy. Over to you, Nico.
Thanks, Mohammed. I really appreciate it. And also, I don't know if you want to give everyone a warning to switch over on interpretation if they need to.
Nico will be speaking in English, and so if you need interpretation, there's an Arabic channel. Thank you.
Lovely. I mean, first of all, I think it's really incredible I can't overstate how important that the declaration was. The Yemen Declaration was absolutely groundbreaking in bringing together a large set of Yemeni organizations that are saying the same call. You know, we need accountability, we need transitional justice, and we've all been documenting these violations for years, and we need the international community to be doing more as part of that. It also obviously, and people have spoken to this already, was just incredibly important on a domestic level. So I think it really spoke to international organizations as a very significant move from the Yemeni civil society to really join forces, come together and say, no, we've been doing this for many years. We have all this documentation, and yet we need this to be a coordinated approach, and we need transitional justice. This can't be an issue that's just ignored in these peace talks, in these negotiations, et cetera. And I hope that will continue to be reflected in international organizations' responses. I think there was a lot of momentum in the beginning, and I think it's very easy for people to let Yemen fall off their radars. And I hope that we can all work together to ensure that it continues to be a top priority internationally. I think on the international level, as to why the UN and other actors have not been as strong on Yemen as they have been in places like Syria and Libya when looking for accountability, it's important to first make clear that there's an important difference here. It's not that there hasn't always been a lack of transitional justice in Yemen. It's also that there were active efforts by different parties to the conflict to actually quash any of those efforts for accountability. In 2016, the UN had established a group of eminent experts, an independent monitoring mechanism to monitor human rights violations and violations of armed conflict within Yemen. And it was only after 4 years of advocacy from Saudi Arabia and the UAE that ultimately this mechanism was disbanded and not renewed. It was the very first time in UN Human Rights Council history that an investigative mechanism did not have their mandate renewed. So it's incredibly significant and can't be overstated. On the other hand, you also have, countries like the US and the UK who have veto power at the UN Security Council, which is another place that often countries go to seek international support in investigating and monitoring rights abuses. And so when you have another two countries, the US itself is also a party to the conflict. The UK has supported the Saudi-led coalition in the conflict, and they're incredibly powerful countries that do have this position within the UN. It makes it essentially impossible in a lot of settings to actually get the accountability that we need. And it really shows the weaknesses of the UN system and the international system, I think, to say that when you have these powerful countries involved in a conflict, what does that mean for accountability in that country to begin with? So I think that's one area that, it really requires us to think very creatively in the context of Yemen, unfortunately, because we're dealing with all of these different powerful actors who have been involved in these violations, to think about how can we get around that and how can we find accountability and transitional justice, even when all of this is stacked up against the context. I think when it comes to the special envoy, it also is another area where, you have to question the priorities of the office. I think there's a fine balance between what the special envoy sees as, getting that peace deal struck and having a ceasefire actually come to fore. And he seems to juxtapose that against accountability and transitional justice. He's not alone. Many people across the world really seem to think that accountability and calling for transitional justice is actually a way it moves against a peace deal and a ceasefire deal. In fact, I think this is a myth, a major myth that we need to be really breaking down and calling out internationally. Human Rights Watch is one of many organizations that has done a lot of research on this. We published a report all the way back in 2009 that looked at countries around the world that we were working in and tried to get at this question of actually, if you are looking at a complex setting that needs transitional justice in the aftermath, is transitional justice actually a barrier to peace? And what we found was actually you need transitional justice, you need accountability in order to have a sustainable peace. And there's no context in which that's more obvious than Yemen. People have already spoken to this. It's something that's already been the cause of these conflicts for many years, the lack of accountability that's come. It's not a new phenomenon that's just coming out of this conflict. And so I think pressing that upon the envoy, pressing that upon the international community, no matter how repetitive we become, is really, really critical for advocacy, because at the end of the day, we can't just be operating in a silo of organizations that care about these issues and are fighting to document things and are trying to fight for accountability. We need that support internationally. We need to be working together, and we also need those organizations and entities and governments to actually be actively supporting this as well. And so this message really needs to be clear to them. If they actually genuinely want a peace that's sustainable in Yemen and not just something that's written down on paper as, look, we have this peace deal and we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know how sustainable it is, but we did it. If they want a genuine peace, then they need to consider accountability and justice now rather than waiting in the future.
شكرا سيدة نيكو.
Thank you very much, Nico,
بهذه التغطية حاول
for covering these important points on the different contexts and also some of the myths, maybe some of the differences also between the conflict in Yemen, and the importance of the declaration in trying to lead to this coordination and push forward that process and as a completion of the documentation. Maysa mentioned at the beginning of in her first intervention of the importance of transitional justice and also the very vicious response that we usually see from parties to the conflict and how it's only getting worse with them seeing that transitional justice is off the table. And so this leads me to a question to Mehdi. The most recent waves of arrests that were carried out by the Sana'a authorities against activists and employees of civil society organizations, could you please give us an overview of what developments have occurred with these arrests? The arrests have been carried out since the beginning of the war, but why have they been focused on much more recently? Why has it increased and why? Thank you, Mohammed. The most recent waves of arrests were a great point of focus, both at the local and international levels, especially since they've targeted those working in the humanitarian field in international organizations and in embassies, and they were accused of espionage. This accusation has caused an additional problem from these arrests. There are people who work in the humanitarian field who have been greatly affected by this because this stigmatizes them, this stigmatizes their families, and even their children, for example, are called the sons of the are insulted and called sons of the spy in those areas. And these arrests also came at a time when people expected that political solutions were not that far off. I also think that these arrests occurred at a very sensitive period. And I think that at a time when we saw that a peaceful settlement was possible, they also targeted prominent individuals, including political activists, including human rights defenders, journalists. And this has caused concern and fear in civil society as a whole about the freedom of expression and peaceful opposition. Yes, unfortunately, this was a very shocking development. People had expected a breakthrough and for things to improve, but this wave of arrests, I think, made people feel like things were moving backwards. But my question to Huda now is this behavior, is it is this behavior just limited to this wave of arrests?
هل هذا سلوك
And
قاصر على ما قام به الحوثيين أم أنه يعني يتشارك فيها الجميع؟
is this something that is primarily being done by the authorities in Sana'a or the Houthis, or is this something that all of the actors engage in? And also, what is the danger of this spreading to other parts of the country or to other authorities with other actors carrying out the same measures?
بالتأكيد هذا سؤال يعني مهم جدا.
I think that's a very important
وعادة ما
question,
نؤكد عليه من خلال
and something that I usually
أعمالنا في مسألة الرصد والتوثيق.
reiterate during our work
انتهاكات أو جرائم
in
الاعتقال
documenting and
التعسفي
monitoring.
والإخفاء
But these kinds
القسري
of crimes,
وقذف الخرج
enforced
والقانون
disappearances,
للأسف ارتكبت
extrajudicial
في
killings,
كل
and other
في
similar
بلاد اليمن
violations
ومن
have
كل
been
أطراف
committed in
الصراع.
all parts of the
ولكن
country and
بنسب
by all
متفاوتة لا
actors to the
تقتصر فقط على
conflict, but at
جماعة
different
الحوثيين ولا تقتصر
levels.
على
It is
طرف
not
معين.
limited just to the
ولكن
Houthis or to any
من
other
خلال
single
عملنا
actor.
في هذا الملف
Based on our work on this
تأكدنا
file,
أن كل الأطراف في
we've
اليمن
seen that all of the
ارتكبت
actors
مثل
in
هذه
Yemen
الجرائم
have
وبالتالي
committed similar crimes.
وإذا جئنا إلى حملة الاعتقالات
If we
الأخيرة
look
التي
at
قامت بها
this
جماعة
most
الحوثيين
recent wave
تحمل في طياتها تهديدات
campaign of arrests,
جسيمة لعمل المجتمع
this
المدني في اليمن
is a grave threat to civil society in Yemen as a whole, especially civil society operating in the areas under the control of the Houthis, but even the areas that are under the control of the internationally recognized government. One of the biggest threats
واجهت المجتمع المدني
One
من
of the
خلال
biggest
حملة
threats that
الاعتقالات
faced
إنه
civil
هذه
society
الاعتقالات
during
تهدف
this
بشكل
campaign of arrests was that
أساسي
these
إلى تأميم
arrests
الأفواه ومنع أي صوت
were aimed
معارض
at
أو
keeping people
منتقد
quiet, ensuring
بأي
that no
سلطة
one would be critical
أمر
or
واقع في أي
opposed to
منطقة
any de
جغرافية في
facto
اليمن. أيضا
authority
الترهيب
anywhere in the country.
من مسألة
It was also
الاعتقالات
meant to terrorize
توقيف عمل
people
المنظمات
because this
الحقوقية
would hinder the
والإنسانية في اليمن.
activities of rights
أيضا مسألة
organizations and humanitarian
من
organizations
خلال
in the country.
الاعتقالات استهدف الحوثي بشكل خاص
With these arrests, the
العاملين في
Houthis
المجال الإنساني مما
specifically
يعيق
targeted those working in the
المساعدات
field of
وصول
human rights
المساعدات إلى
and
المحتاجين
humanitarian
ويزيد أيضا
field.
من
This would also
معاناة
hinder
اليمنيين وخاصة إنه
assistance being delivered to those most in need and would increase the suffering of Yemenis, especially since the situation in the country has gotten to the point where it is and has been one of the biggest humanitarian disasters in the world. These arrests also caused an escalation in the crisis, with the number of IDPs and detainees increasing and also leading to deterioration of basic service provision in the country. The arrests also affected Yemen's reputation at both the regional and international levels and has increased the country's isolation. It has also expanded the conflict. It has delayed any potential settlements or negotiations, and we've seen that there had been many negotiations on economic issues or humanitarian issues. The most recent round of talks on the detainees and prisoners was unable to achieve any success. And even the discussions of the most recent arrests of UN employees in Sana'a was not discussed during that round, and there were no positive results from that round of talks, and so this is one of the impacts. With regards to the impact that this campaign would have in the areas under the control of the PLC or the internationally recognized government. First, I don't think we can compare between the two, what is happening in the areas under the control of the Houthis and under the internationally recognized government. At least in the areas under the control of the internationally recognized government, there is some freedom or some room to criticize the de facto authorities and to criticize the groups in power, whether they are the government itself or the components of the Presidential Leadership Council, like the Southern Transitional Council and their armed militias. But there have been challenges. There have been challenges that this escalation caused. This might scare off activists and human rights defenders, even in other areas not under the control of the Houthis. This will also curb their ability to operate. There have been attempts to copy the practices of Houthis. And I think that the international community not ignoring or neglecting to do anything about these violations has encouraged a lot of the other actors to carry out the same kinds of violations because of the impunity that they see. Also, in the areas under the control of the IRG, we have seen that there were investigations carried out by the Public Prosecutor's Office that showed that security forces carried out perpetrated human rights violations with extrajudicial killings and imprisonments and enforced disappearance. There are attempts to investigate it, but unfortunately, the actors behind them do not want there to be any accountability for this. And this impunity only further encourages future violations. There was also a smear campaign against journalists and media figures whenever they talk about these kinds of violations and try to shine a light on them. And this obviously curbs the freedom of expression and the role of the media. There is also a negative impact in that they affect the work of actors trying to reach a political settlement, and it only further complicates the political situation in the country. These arrests by the Houthis are also a direct threat to any hope for peace and stability in Yemen, and they reiterate the dire need to pressure all of the actors involved in these violations and all of the parties to the conflict to stop violence and to respect human rights.
شكرا
Thank you very much, Huda.
أعود إليك أستاذة نيكو.
If we could go back to Nico now. Huda mentioned that she mentioned specifically a criticism of international organizations and of the silence of the international community. And I think that's something that we've always focused on in Yemen, about the lack of engagement or focus on these issues that we as Yemenis see as being important. And so, based on what Huda said about what she sees as a silence by the international community, from your perspective, what do you think is the justification for this? What is the reason for this? And what is the moral and what is the responsibility of the various organizations and embassies whose own staff and personnel were arrested?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you, Huda, for everything that you said. I really think that you highlighted incredibly important things about the Houthi arrests. I think when it comes to the international community, giving them the benefit of the doubt, I think many are very scared of speaking out about the arrests in terms of their own staff safety. I think what they have said in many instances is that if we speak out, we're putting the people who have already been arrested at further risk because their families don't want us to speak about it. The Houthis have told them that they're not going to release them if we speak about it, etc. So I think that's one reason. The second reason is also that they're very worried about the stuff that they still have in Houthi-controlled territories that have not been arrested yet. So I think a lot of their silence, at least on their end, would be explained by this. But the problem here is that this is not a new issue that's happening in Yemen. You know, the Houthis have been arresting people in their territories for ages, including U.S. embassy staff. As we've seen, they've been releasing these video confessions of them from people that they've arrested in 2021. And the problem here is that these organizations have continued to operate and not spoken out very strongly over the last few years, even though the Houthis have made their intentions quite clear. No one has doubted what they're capable of, and I think it's a miscalculation if organizations felt that they could continue operating in these spaces and continue honestly capitulating and giving in to a lot of what the Houthis' demands are, no matter how ridiculous in some cases, without being worried that they're going to become so strong in this sense and feel so much impunity that they would go ahead and arrest this many staff in the future. Obviously, no one could have predicted this to this degree, but and I don't mean to say that, you know, I blame these organizations in any sense. No one could have predicted what the Houthis have done. But I think it's really important at this point when organizations and embassies and governments have said the reasons that they're not speaking out, for them to really think back to all the years of the Houthis doing this and think about it more collectively and say, okay, in the past, you know, cases have generally fared better where people have spoken out. And when there is public attention, they do feel pressure sometimes. And the more we stay silent, we're hearing from people that, okay, our staff is now being seen as complicit in an espionage network. the Houthis have been saying these false rumors and spreading these lies about them. And yet the more we stay silent, the more at risk these people will be, because they're being seen as actually being truthful. Maybe the Houthis are correct because these organizations aren't standing up for their employees. And so I think that's what we're, incredibly concerned about at the moment, is their silence is contributing to the problem, even if they think that they're in the right on this. And I do very much see it. It is an incredibly complicated problem. There's not a clear right answer here, but I do think that what needs to be done is that organizations need to be coming in a very unified way. People who have had their staff arrested, people who haven't had their staff arrested, governments that are donor states, regardless of how strong of a donor state it is, or just governments in general, people who aren't donating to humanitarian aid in Yemen. Like, there needs to be a very strong unified approach so that the Houthis don't have an option of just picking apart employees of one organization versus another because that organization spoke out. And I think my greatest, the analysis that I see here in terms of the fault of international community with responding to these arrests is that, it's understanding where they're coming from and being silent, but I don't think that they're moving fast enough on this unified approach. I think they know that they need to do this, and yet they have taken such a long time to come forward and really do that. They've said, the UN has made several statements. Some organizations have made some statements, but in terms of a very strong response that's needed in a situation like this is not an everyday situation to have this many people arrested and this many people under threat, continued threat. I don't see them as working quickly enough to figure out exactly what they need to be saying and doing, how to provide support to the families of those who have been detained, and make sure that they feel as safe as possible, or try to get them out if they want to leave, supporting the staff of other organizations who are still there and might want to leave the North as well. They should be giving those people those options. And I don't see a unified approach happening quickly enough. And that's where I think many of us have been forced to question, is this because these are all Yemeni staff? And would they have responded differently if they were international staff? And I think the answer is yes. I'm sure they would have responded differently if it was international staff. And I really hope that, they really put as much energy as they need to immediately into figuring this out and using this unified approach and coming together and responding to this in a concerted way, and not just continuing to operate in Houthi-controlled territories in a situation where people are fearing for their lives, fearing that they're going to be arrested, but not getting any guidance from these organizations about what they should do.
بالتأكيد نيكو هي هناك اعتبارات
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Nico. I think there are a lot of very complicated considerations that have to be taken into account, of trying to balance between the safety of those who have been detained and trying to also keep those who haven't been detained yet safe. And like you said, there's also there's a need for a more concerted and coordinated response by all organizations, embassies, actors, etc. Thank you very much, Nick. Going back to Mesa, you mentioned the transitional justice in the beginning, but now we're talking about this recent campaign of arrests. But you mentioned that these violations have only gotten more vicious and brutal the longer the war has gone on. What is the reason for this? Is there a political reasoning or justification? Why this timing for the campaign of arrests? And to what extent do you think this will affect civil society, as Huda has mentioned? Well, first, I think that I think this has been the case for a very long time, with many arrests being conducted. If we look at, for example, the American embassy and the arrests against its employees, they were detained years ago in many cases, and all it would take is, and all it would have taken, there were channels open for negotiations between the Americans and the Houthis, where they were negotiating through Muscat. It wasn't that there were no channels of communication between them, and they could have pressured to secure the release of these employees, but these employees were left without any form of protection, despite the responsibility, the moral responsibility of the embassy and the American government for them. And this also applies to many other organizations. Some employees of the United Nations, for example, who had been detained in the past. And the response, there was just a few statements of condemnation here and there, nothing more than that. And so I think that these responses, especially from the international community, has
على
led to
موظفينها
more and more
المحليين
impunity. The fact that they
ووضحت
seem to have
بمصالحهم
given
من
up
أجل
their
استمرار
local
عملياتها
employees and
باعتبارها
sacrificed
عمليات
their own
أيضا
interests and
يعني هي
safety for
بالنسبة
their
لهم
operations to continue because these
كأنها شكل
operations
استخدام
are
شكل من
important.
أشكال القوى
First, it's a
الأدوات
form of
الناعمة اللي بتستخدمها
soft
القوى
power
الدولية
for
المختلفة.
these donors and for these
أيضا
actors
هي
to
نوع
use in
من
Yemen, and it's also
أيضا
a form of
بتشغل موظفين عندهم.
a way
فهذا كله في سبيل
source of
استمرار
employment. And so
العمليات
for
ضحوا
these operations to
بموظفيهم
continue, it
المحليين.
seems like
حاليا
these
الحجة الجديدة
previously
إنه أيضا
detained
الموظفين يناقشون
employees were sacrificed. And
امتداد
now
الاعتقالات بقية الموظفين المحليين.
there are
المسألة
fears
هي
that
فقط
the
إن
detentions will
الاعتقالات
continue,
تسعى
will
دائرتها
expand. The only difference
أزداد
now is that
وحشيتها
they've broadened the number of arrests. They've
لم
gotten
أزداد على
more
عدة
vicious. Also,
مستويات.
repression has increased
عدد
at
المعتقلين
differing
أكبر
levels.
بكثير مما نعرف
The number of detainees is
لأنه
much
كثير
higher
من
than has
الأسر
been
تميل إلى عدم
mentioned
التبليغ
because I think, like Nico
بسبب
said, many of the
خشيتها
families
وبسبب
did not
مخاوف
want
عقيدة أفراد الأسرة في
to
صنعاء
advocate or
يشعرون
to
أنهم
publicly
ممكن
announce that their
يتعرضوا
family
إلى
members were
مشاكل
detained
إضافية
because they felt like they could
لو
get a deal
قاموا
another
بالإبلاغ
way,
عن
or that
أبنائهم.
they would put the
عادة
whole family at risk if
بتلقي
the
بعض
case was
الوعود من
publicized.
المسؤولين الحوثيين
Sometimes they
أنهم
might
إذا
get
صمتوا
promises from Houthi
إذا
officials that
التزموا
if they keep
بالصمت
quiet
إن هذا
and
بيأتي فرص
cooperate,
أفضل
then this
للإفراج
will
عنهم.
improve the chances
إنه هذا
of the
عادة
detainee
لا
being
يحدث.
released. And this is actually based on previous experience.
هذا
This has not been
كله
the case.
أدى إلى أنه
All
ازداد
of
توحش
this
الحوثيين
has led to
إضافة
the
إلى
Houthis
أنه
becoming
الضغط
much
الدولي
more brazen in
والإقليمي
these kinds of operations.
والمحلي
And also
يساعد.
the situation at
بمعنى
the local,
إنه
regional,
حاليا
international levels
الظرف
is also
الإقليمي
supports
والدولي
them.
منشغل
At the
بشكل
regional,
كبير في مواجهة
international
حرب
levels,
غزة.
the world is much more
تحول
focused on what's
الحوثيين إلى
happening in the
أبطال
Gaza war. And
بسبب
also the fact that the
المحاكاة
Houthis
المخيفة والمفزعة اللي
are
بيقوم
becoming to
فيها
seen
الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ضد أهل
as
غزة
heroes because of
وحالة
the
الإبادة العرقية التي
brutal
يتعرض لها أبناء غزة
violations committed
أدت
by
إلى
the
تحويل
Israelis against the
الحوثيين
people of Gaza and the
كداعمين
genocide being
كأبطال
carried out against them. This has
أمام
made the
العالم
Houthis to be
بغض
seen
النظر عما
as
يحدث داخل
heroes
اليمن
in
واليمن
the region
دائما
and the rest
لا
of the world,
تنظر لها
regardless of
كدولة.
what's happening in Yemen. Yemen is actually, this has been one of the biggest problems that we've had. It's never seen as its own
كنا
state.
نرى أيام الحرب أو نتمنى أنها
During
بالفعل انتهت بالهدنة التي حدثت من أبريل 2022
with the
إنه
truce
يمكن
in
ينظر
April
لها من
22,
زاوية
we've
السعودية.
seen that Yemen has been seen
الآن
as
حاليا
just
اليمن
the
أيضا
Saudi
ينظر
Arabia's
لها من
backyard.
زاوية
And
مثل
now Yemen and the
المقاومة
Houthis are
ونشوط
seen
المقاومة
as being a
وغيرها من
part of the
الأمور.
axis of
وبالتالي
resistance and
اليمن
their
كدولة
participation. But Yemen
دائما
as
ينظر
a
مجتمعها
separate,
إلى
as a
مصالحها
country,
بشكل
its
منسجم
society and its
أو
interests are
منفصل.
not seen independently
أيضا
of either
الحوثيين
being
يحاولوا
affiliated with
استباق ما
Saudi
حدث
Arabia
لهم
or
أثناء
Iran.
الهدنة.
And the
أثناء
Houthis are
الهدنة
also
الحوثي
trying
تعرضوا
to
لضغوط شعبية
preempt what
واسعة
happened or to
أشعرتهم
prevent what
بأنهم
happened to them at the
ممكن
beginning of the
يتعرضوا
truce, because they were
لإشكاليات
under a lot of
كبيرة
public pressure.
بسبب
And I think the Houthis felt
بقايا
like
الظهور المدني
they could
في
face
المجتمع.
further challenges
هذا
if
الظهور
civil society
المدني
continues
المتبقي من النشاط
and
المدني
this,
الذي بدأ
what
في يمن
remains of
منذ
civil
عام 2000
society, with civil
منذ
society
منتصف
becoming
2000
much more active in the mid
والذي وصل ذروته
2000s,
في عام
reaching
2011.
a peak in
هذا الحضور
2011.
المدني بيثير
But
توتر
this
الحوثيين
presence of
كجماعة
civil
تريد السيطرة
society worries
كليا
the Houthis, because the
على
Houthis
المجتمع،
are a
تريد
group that
إعادة
wants to take
شكل
full
هندسة
control of
المجتمع
society,
اليمني
one that wants to
بحيث
reshape
يتناسب مع
and
أيديولوجيتها مع
restructure Yemeni
تصورات
society
السلطة
in line
والحكم.
with its ideologies
فهم شعروا
and its
أيضا أن هذه
vision
منظمات
of
المجتمع
governance.
المدني
And so the
أيضا
Houthis felt
تمثل
that these civil society
يمثل أبنائها
organizations
جزء من الطبقة الوسطى المنفتحة على العالم وهم
represent
يميلون إلى عزلة اليمن.
middle class of Yemeni
فبالتالي
society, one
هم
that is more open
استهدفوا
to
هذه
the
الأبناء
outside world,
منظمات
and they
المجتمع
want
المدني وجدوا أن
to
الظرف
make them
الإقليمي
more
والدولي
isolated. And
يساعدهم.
so because they saw
الظرف
that the regional
المحلي
and
في ظل
international
حالة
situations were
التشييد
supportive of
للحروب
this, and
وبداية
also
استئناف الحرب هذه
because
المرة
of
من دول
possible resumption of
أمريكا
war
وبريطانيا وإسرائيل، وهي بكل تأكيد
by
دول
the United
مكروهة في
States, the
منطقة
UK, and
اليمن
Israel, countries that are hated in the
وتأثيرهم
region,
بعض
and
القاعدة
Yemen,
الشعبية في بعض
has given the
المناطق من
Houthis
بعض
more
الفئات
popular
والشرائح في
support.
المجتمع اليمني، فوجدوا منها فرصة
And so
مثالية
they saw this as
لتوسيع
an
حالة
excellent
القبض.
opportunity for them
وأنا
to
هنا لا
increase the
أعفي
repressive
أيضا
actions. And
المجتمع الدولي وخاصة مكتب
I'm not
المبعوث
trying to
الأممي.
justify
مكتب
what the
المبعوث
international
الأممي
community and
مثلا في
especially the
اليمن
UN Special Envoy's office
لا توجد
did.
فيه
The UN
قوة
Special Envoy's
مختبرات
office
للأعداد
in Yemen
الانتقالية
only
حاليا
has a
يمكن وصفها
single
يكون حالي.
officer who is working on
ملف
transitional
حقوق
justice, and I think the
الإنسان
position is actually vacant
وملف
now.
ملف حقوق
But the
الإنسان
file,
والملف الحقوقي
human rights
بالمناسبة هو ملف
and
أساسي
transitional
في
justice
كل
need to
مكاتب
be
المبعوث الأممي
core
في
files,
المنطقة بما فيها
as
سوريا
we've seen in other
وليبيا،
special
لكن هذا لا
UN
يحدث في
special
الحالة
envoys
اليمنية، وهذا
in Syria and Libya, like we mentioned, but this is something that hasn't happened in Yemen, and I think it is tantamount to taking Yemenis and their suffering and the crisis lightly. And so the UN Special Envoy's Office, and the international community needs to reconsider their perspectives and the way that they deal with the Yemeni file, because it seems like it has been very neglectful and is colluded with the parties to the conflict in order to achieve any form of political settlement. This, even if it comes at the cost of the people of Yemen and the victims of this conflict, they don't care if this settlement lasts or does not, but they just want to achieve any kind of agreement. And that's what we've seen when they supported the truce in April 2022, and the GCC initiative, which gave Ali Abdullah Saleh and his government impunity. It was unconditional immunity for him and all who had supported them. And this kind of unconditional immunity was one of the reasons for the transitional period not succeeding. And also the fact that the Houthis in April 2022, when the truce started, when the negotiations started, without any talk of any violations of human rights, of trying to deal with the root causes of the conflict, this only led to the Houthis becoming more brutal in their approach. And they started to become more of a threat at both the local, regional, and international levels. Thank you very much, Mesa. I don't think it's a very optimistic perspective or what might happen. We're obviously all fully supportive of the victims of the detentions and their families, and we understand what's even more difficult is for them to continue to have to remain silent. We'll take another quick round of questions before we open up the floor for questions from the attendees. And so I had a question that I wanted to ask all of the panelists of what comes next. And so we'll start with Huda. After Mesa's intervention and this very dismal view of the future of human rights and accountability and justice in Yemen, so how could we continue to discuss and work on justice and reconciliation in Yemen with the divides that we see, with the divisions and with the deterioration of that file? What comes next in your perspective, Huda? Thank you very much, Mohammed. I think that comes at the core of the challenge that civil society in Yemen are facing. So on one hand, there is increasing public pressure and a public will for accountability and for transitional justice. But at the end of on the other side, we also have a long history of continued violations, which lead to people having less and less confidence in any reconciliation or settlement. We need to reiterate that transitional justice and reconciliation are not a luxury. They are a necessity for any sustainable peace in Yemen. Without dealing with the crimes of the past, the root causes of the conflict will continue, and we will continue to have cycles of violence that will never end. The second point is that there needs to be a very clear recognition that any settlement or any agreement needs to be based on certain principles and values, including uncovering the fates of victims, of documenting these violations in a systematic manner. And those responsible for perpetrating these violations need to be held criminally accountable for their violations and ensuring that they do not have impunity for their actions. Victims must also be given reparations. This could be done through material or moral reparations. And there need to also be mechanisms put in place to ensure that these violations will not be repeated in the future, and building strong institutions that respect human rights, especially security institutions and law enforcement institutions. With regards to this, what comes next, what step comes next, human rights organizations and activists need to continue their excellent efforts in documenting the violations carried out by all of the parties to the conflict. And civil society and the public must pressure the parties to the conflict and the international community to demand an end to these violations and a start of a real reconciliation process. And the issue of human rights violations in Yemen needs to become more of a priority at the international level, to be discussed at international meetings and events, and also ensure accountability, especially since the judicial system in Yemen is one that is very divided and fragmented, and I do not think that it will be able to hold those who perpetrated these
أو حتى
violations
مسألة إنه
accountable.
يجب تأهيل القضاء اليمني لأنه تأهيل
And
القضاء
the Yemeni
اليمني
judiciary needs to
يتطلب
also be
جهود
rehabilitated, but this is something
وسنوات
that will require
طويلة،
many
وهذا
years and
سوف
a lot
يكون
of
بعد
effort.
انتهاء
And this is
الصراع
something that can
والبدء
occur
لصالح
after the
الوطني.
end of the
وبالتالي
conflict and
من
the beginning
المهم
of national
بمكان تدوير
reconciliation.
ملف
And so it's
مشاركة
very
حقوق الإنسان
important
في اليمن
for human rights
وتأسيس أو
violations to be
إنشاء آلية
documented
دولية
and for there to be an
للتحقيق
international
انتهاكات
mechanism
حقوق الإنسان طبعا
to
والبعض هنا
investigate
سوف يخالفون الرأي،
allegations of
لكن
human rights. Some
الوضع
might disagree
اليمني
with me on
يحتم
this, but I think that the
إنه
situation in Yemen,
يستفيد الضحايا من كل الآليات المتواجدة. كان في
the
المجتمع
situation that we've
المدني،
reached in Yemen
الآلية
means that
الوطنية،
victims
حتى
can use
الآليات
any
الدولية.
mechanisms available to them, whether they're
يمر
through
على
civil
مختلف
society,
القوى
national
السياسية
mechanisms, or
والاجتماعية في
international
اليمن
mechanisms.
توافق أيضا على رؤية
Political
المشاركة
and social
لعملية
actors in Yemen need to
المصالحة
also reach a
وتوجيه
consensus
سياسيات
on the mechanism
تنفيذها.
for
البناء
how
أيضا
a
على
reconciliation will
بناء
be carried
الثقة
out
بين
and
الأطراف
implemented.
المتنازعة
And there
من
also
خلال
needs to be
حوار
work on
أمام
building
الضيوف
confidence
والطريق
between the
وبناء
parties to the conflict
علاقات
through
يعني
open
علاقات
dialogue,
تعاون. علينا أن نعي أنه
coordination, and
عملية
cooperation.
المصالحة
We need to
ستكون
recognize
طويلة وشاقة
that the
بحجة الوضع اليمني،
reconciliation and transitional justice
وبتتطلب
process will be a
يعني
very
صبر
long one, and
وتفاني
it will be
من
very
الجميع،
complex,
ولكن
and it will need
هي
patience
السبيل
and
الوحيد
understanding
لتحقيق
on
السلام
all of our parts, but
والاستقرار
it's the
في
only way
اليمن.
to achieve
أيضا
peace
يجب
and
على أنه
stability in the
التأكيد
country.
على أنه
And we also
مسؤولية
need to
تحقيق العدالة
reiterate that the
والمصالحة تقع
responsibility of
على عاتق
achieving
الجميع، الأطراف اليمنية
responsibility,
منظمات
or
المجتمع المدني،
reconciliation
الأطراف
and transitional
الإقليمية
justice
وأيضا
is all of
المجتمع
our
الدولي.
responsibility, civil society,
يمكن
the
أنه
public,
القول
the
أنه
actors,
الحديث عن
the various
العدالة
political and social
والمصالحة في ظل
actors, the
هذه الظروف
international and regional
الصعبة ليست
communities.
بالأمر
I know
المستحيل،
that discussing
ولكن
transitional justice
بالضرورة
in these
مريحة
dire
لبناء
circumstances is
مستقبل
difficult,
أفضل
but
في اليمن.
it's a necessity for a better future in Yemen.
شكرا لك أستاذة
Thank you
هدى.
very much, Huda.
أرجع إليك أستاذة نيكو.
Going back to
تحدثت
Nico,
الأستاذة هدى
Huda
عن
spoke about
ضعف القضاء في اليمن،
the
وهنا السؤال الذي
weak
يعني
judicial system in Yemen, and I think
يعني ما
this
قيمة
takes us to a question of,
عمل مع تقديري بالتأكيد
with
لعمل
all
المنظمات
due
الحقوقية ولا
respect and
سيما
appreciation
Human
for the
Rights
work
Watch.
that you do
ما
for
قيمة
human rights
هذه
organizations, especially
التوثيق؟
Human
قيمة
Rights Watch.
التوثيق إذا لم يكن هناك قضاء،
what is the
إذا لم
purpose, or
يكن
what is the
هناك
value of this
محاسبة.
documentation if there is
ماذا
no
بعد
judicial system, if there
عملية
is no
التوثيق
accountability? What comes
ولا
after the
أهميته في
documentation
العدالة
of these violations,
الانتقالية
and also
أو في
what is
عمل
its
العدالة
importance in the
والمصالحة؟
transitional justice process or in justice and reconciliation?
Thanks, Mohammed. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try to shy away from the fact that we're at a particular moment that's really shining a light on how futile sometimes international human rights can be, and the international legal system can be. We're watching, a genocide occur in Gaza while we're going about our as we continue to document violations all over the region that still are not being, held accountable for. But I think what Huda said really rings true. Sometimes the road to justice can be very long, and we need to be a bit patient. I don't think that our efforts are in vain. I think we need to be documenting things. I think civil society in Yemen has done an incredible job over the last 10 years of documenting violations, and that those are necessary, even if the timeline is much longer than what we expect for when transitional justice is going to happen, when accountability is going to happen. It's true that there are many problems within Yemen's legal system. I think regarding, on the Yemeni side of things and the domestic legal system, we don't know what might come. Those problems could change in the future. And again, sometimes these issues take many years to resolve, and the legal system is very slow to begin with. It's not meant to be a reactive, quick process, usually, unfortunately. On the international side, though, I think that's really where the declaration and civil society's efforts to continue documenting things is really critical. It really demonstrates to the international community why it is so necessary to keep paying attention to what's happening in Yemen and keep pushing for an investigative mechanism to be set up. At the end of the day, even if Yemen did have a very strong judiciary, it still would not be strong enough to prosecute some of these violations, considering that a lot of the violators are not even Yemeni to begin with. And so it's not something that the international community can ignore. And it's something that they need to take a much stronger effort on their own without everyone needing to constantly push and push and push every single year to try to get any of this accountability. They should see themselves and recognize themselves the importance of this effort and the importance of the documentation that civil society has been doing, and actually take it upon themselves if they genuinely care about, seeing a future of peace in Yemen, It needs to be something that they actually do put energy and effort into at the Human Rights Council, again, at different international forums. You have all of these states that are contributing millions and millions of dollars of humanitarian aid into Yemen. And yet that is not going to be something that can be a long-term solution in a context in which people are, all of these violators are just impunable. And we don't have a response to them, and we're not holding them accountable. So I hope that we can continue our efforts, that we continue our documentation efforts, but I also hope that the international community takes a much greater stance and takes a much bigger approach in actually advocating for seeing accountability for all of this documentation that people have so tirelessly documented over the years.
شكرا نيكو لأن الوقت
Thank you,
يمشي
Nico.
سريعاً.
Time has gone
أعود إليك
very
أستاذ
quickly, and so we
مهدي
wanted to very quickly go
وتعقيبا
back
على ما
to
تم
Mehdi.
الحديث عنه في دور المجتمع المدني عموما
Based on what was
والمجتمع
said
بشكل عام
by the panelists on the
دوره
role of
تقديم الدعم
civil society
للمعتقلين
organizations
وأسرهم،
and
وأظن البعض
society as a
تحدث
whole in providing
عن أيضا
support to the
الاستجمة التي
detainees and to their
تحصل
families. And I think someone has spoken about
على
the
أفراد أو
stigmatization
المعتقلين بأنهم
of
أبناء
the
جواسيس
detainees
وما إلى ذلك.
and
ما
their
هو الدعم
families.
الذي يجب
What
أن
kind of
يقدم
support needs to be or should be
للمعتقلين
provided
وأسرهم؟
to these detainees
شكراً
and to their
أخي
families?
محمد،
Thank you very much,
واسمح لي
Mohammed.
أعود إلى نقطة إلى
If
الوراء.
you'll allow me, I wanted to
إنه
go
بعض
back to a
المنظمات
previous
التي
point that
انسحبت
some
كانت هناك تهديدات
organizations
عليها من جماعة
that
الحوثي عند
withdrew from the
تواصلي بالكثير
declaration
من
withdrew because of
المنظمات
threats
والمعارف
from the Houthis. I
بعد
contacted
إطلاق
many
البيان
organizations
تعرضوا
after the launch of the
للمضايقات
declaration, and they had initially
والتهديدات،
signed it,
حتى أن البعض قام
but they were
بتغيير
threatened, and some of them had
مجال
to
عمل منظمته إلى
completely
عمل
change the field
إغاثي
that their
بدلا من كان
organization
عملها
works in,
إنساني أو
changing
تنموي.
it from human rights, for example,
وعاتبنا
or
زملائنا في
development
هذا
to
المناطق
humanitarian.
حتى
And I
أنهم
think we
أبدوا لي إنه
understand
ما الذي
this reason for
سيقدمه
some
المجتمع
organizations
الدولي
withdrawing.
في حال
And
أننا
many of them even asked me, they said,
استمرينا.
even if we continue with our
زملائنا
signing
اليوم
on the
اعتقلوا
declaration,
لهم
what will the
عدة
international community
أشهر
do to
والبعض عدة
support us? Some of
سنوات،
them
وما
have been
الذي قدمه
some people have been
المجتمع
detained
الدولي.
for months
كانوا
or even years,
يتواصلون
and
بي
what has the
ويفيدوا
international
أنه
community
نحن
done
لم
for them?
نعد بالمجتمع
They
الدولي،
told me
لم
that
نثق بهذا
we
المجتمع
no longer
الدولي. ما
trust
الذي
the
يقدمه
international
غير
community. We do
البيانات؟
not think it will do anything other than release a
نشعر
few
بأن هناك
statements.
حتى عنصرية في التمييز
And so we
بين
felt that we had to withdraw from the
الموظفين العاملين
declaration.
في
They also
المجال
feel like there's a
الإنساني
huge amount of
اليمنيين عن
discrimination
الأجانب.
between
نحن
local and
كيمنيين
international staff working in the
نشعر بأنه
humanitarian
لا
sector.
قيمة
We as
لنا
Yemenis
عند
feel like
المجتمع الدولي بالرغم
the
من إحنا
international,
عملنا
we don't
إنساني،
hold any value
فلذلك
to the
خذلنا
international
من المجتمع
community. And
الدولي
so
قبل
we
أن
feel like
نقبل
the
من
international
الجهات
community
الأخرى.
has
بالنسبة لعملنا
neglected its
كمجتمع مدني
responsibility
يمكننا أن
towards us
نلعب
and towards
دورا
civil
محوريا في
society.
دعم المعتقلين وأسرهم
Civil society can
وحفظ
play a very
حقوقهم
important role
كجزء
in
من قضية العدالة
supporting
والمصالحة
detainees
في
and their
اليمن،
families, ensuring that
مثل
their rights are
التوعية
preserved. This can
والتوثيق.
be done through
من
awareness
المهم
raising, through
أن نعمل على
documentation.
توثيق جميع
And it's important
المتهمات
that we
التي
work on
يتعرض لها
documenting all of
المعتقلون
these kinds of
بما في ذلك
violations that
تفاصيل اعتقالهم
detainees are
وظروف
subject to,
احتجازهم.
including details
يجب أن تقوم
of their
بجمع
detentions.
الشهادات والأدلة
This can
ونشرها
be
عبر
done
وسائل
through
الإعلام
gathering
ومنصات التواصل
testimonies and
الاجتماعي
statements and,
لتسليط الضوء على هذه
publicizing them and
القضايا
releasing them on
وتوثيق
social media
الانتهاكات
so that
بما
we can shine a
يسهم
light on
في
these
حماية
issues, on
حقوق
these cases,
المعتقلين وضمان عدم إفلاتهم
ensure
من
the
الإحجاز.
protection of the detainees
أن نعمل على
and the rights.
المسار
It's also
الدولي.
important
يجب
that
أن
civil
ننسق
society
مع
works on
منظمات حقوق الإنسان
advocacy at
الدولية
the
مثل Human
international
Rights
level
Watch
with
والحقوق الدولية
organizations like Human
لزيادة
Rights
الضغط
Watch, like
على
Amnesty
الجهات
International,
المعنية
to
من أجل
increase
الإفراج
pressure
عن المعتقلين.
on the relevant
العمل مع
actors so
المجتمع
that these
الدولي
detainees can be
يمكن أن يساعد
released.
أيضا في اختلال
Working with the
ضغوط
international
دبلوماسية
community
على
will also
السلطات
help
للإفراج عن المعتقلين
increase
أو
diplomatic
على الأقل
and
تحسين
political pressure
ظروف
on
احتجازهم.
the
كذلك
authorities to
الدعم
release them, or at
القانوني.
least to
يجب أن
improve
نؤمن
the
للمعتقلين
circumstances of the
محامين
detentions. And it's also
واستشاريين
important to
قانونيين
provide
للدفاع عن
legal support, to
حقوقهم.
provide lawyers,
المجتمع
and to provide
المدني
the
يمكن أن
necessary
يلعب
legal
دور وسيط
support for
بين
these detainees. Civil
المعتقلين
society can
وأسرهم
play the
والمحامين
role
لضمان توفير
of
الدعم
intermediary
القانوني
between the
اللازم
detainees, their
ومتابعة
families, and
قضاياهم
their
في
legal
المحاكم.
teams to follow up with their cases
الدعم النفسي
and
والمالي.
represent them. It's
أسر
also important to
المعتقلين غالبا
provide
ما يعانون من أزمات
support. The
نفسية
families of the
ومادية
detainees have
نتيجة الاعتقال.
psychosocial problems
تبرعات
as well
من
as
حملات
financial
تدعمهم.
problems, and so this can be
يمكننا توفير
they can be
المساعدات المالية
supported
لتغطية
through fundraising
احتياجاتهم
efforts
الأساسية،
and through
بالإضافة إلى
communication
تقديم
and
الدعم
support
النفسي أيضا عبر برامج مخصصة
and
تساعدهم في
providing
التعامل مع
psychosocial
الضغوطات
support
والتحديات.
through
خصوصا
programs
أنه في
that help
الفترة
them deal
الأخيرة
with these
استمعنا بأن جماعة
pressures. Especially
الحوثي
since
قامت
recently we've
بتوقيف
heard that the Houthis
حسابات الموظفين
have stopped the
المعتقلين، وهذا
balances
أيضا
of the
سيسبب
detainees,
أزمة
or stopped the
للمعتقلين.
suspended the accounts or
كذلك
frozen the
الضغط
accounts of the
السياسي.
detainees, and this
المجتمع
will increase the
المدني أن
pressure
يلعب
on their
دورا عن
families.
الضغط على
It's also
الجهات
important for
السياسية
there to be
المعنية
pressure
بقضية
on the relevant
الاعتقالات
political
وضم
actors
المظاهرات السلمية والكتابة
to
على
organize them peaceful demonstrations and to advocate to legislators and political officials And this is also another important way to advocate for their release and to ensure that these kinds of violations are not repeated. It's also important to include public opinion, local and international public opinion in support of the detainees. This could be done on social media or through the media can increase awareness of this issue and also create more or lead to more sympathy for detainees and their families. And this also ensures that there is a real solidarity movement or coalition. There also needs to be continued observation and monitoring of the detainees even after the release to ensure that there are no actions to take retribution, as well as ensuring that they are reintegrated back into society with dignity. And so we as individuals or as civil society organizations can play a very important role in maintaining and preserving the rights of the detainees and their families.
أستاذ مهدي.
Thank you very much, Mahdi.
طبعا هو نشكر للمشاركة، أما هو الكلام ثقيل حقيقة.
I know that this has been very difficult topic to discuss and to think about all of these violations, especially the most recent ones of the detainees and their suffering. Before we open the floor for questions, questions will only be taken in writing, unfortunately, but there's a Q&A box. And so if you have your hand raised, if you could please write your question in the Q&A box. Mesa, because we started with you, if I could ask my last question in this round to you. While talking about transitional justice and detentions, it has been a year since the launch of the declaration, and Niku said that there was momentum at the beginning, but it has been a year now. And what has been done? What other steps have been taken during this first year of the declaration? Well, first, I wanted to clarify something that, like Mahdi said, many organizations have come under pressure, specifically by the Houthis, to not sign the declaration. Even some regional actors had their own concerns about the declaration. They saw it as hindering the peace process. And this is also a position adopted by Western states, including the UN's Special Envoy himself, when human rights and the justice and accountability should be core principles of an office like the Office of the UN Special Envoy. And I think this has been a very difficult problem to deal with. The most recent waves of arrests will further hinder any kind of coordination between Yemeni organizations. But I always encourage the idea of dialogue amongst the Yemenis and also continuing dialogue amongst ourselves of the issue of transitional justice is still very important. And this is important even if there isn't any peace in the near future. Even if the war does not end, we must continue to discuss and to further develop and crystallize these ideas. This will ensure that we are better positioned to force the parties to the conflict whenever the war ends, whether it's because one side comes out as a victor or because they've reached an agreement for any reason or there's international pressure. But this will ensure our discussion and development of these ideas will ensure that we can pressure them to include it in the final settlement. And this is something that we will continue to struggle for, even if peaceful settlement seems so far away, because at the end of the day, this is our future as Yemenis, and these are our rights that we need to ensure are maintained and preserved. If they are ignored when the war ends, they will not be remembered during the peace building or development, and this will lead to further cycles of violence by those who sense or feel that their suffering and the violations against them were not taken into account, and so they will want to take revenge for what happened to them. This will cause further cycles of violence, just like the previous cycles of violence that we've seen in Yemen. Many of the political actors, even now, are a result of previous violations like the Southern Hirak, and now the Southern Transitional Council is presenting itself as an actor that represents the suffering of the Southerners, despite the fact that the STC itself is committing the very same violations. But I would also, we always need to reiterate that the ideas like the idea of immunity, of impunity, of no accountability is what encourages continuing violations. And this war has had the most major, or the biggest violations because there were several rounds of violence in the past where no one was held accountable, and national reconciliation and agreement would only occur at the level of the elites while ignoring the needs and interests of the people. And so this is the same scenario being repeated, and people feel like this is going to happen once again at the end of this conflict. And to do this and to continue this discussion, the Sana'a Center by continuing this discussion and by benefiting from the experience of other contexts, the Sana'a Center believes it is important to provide a perspective on transitional justice. And this can be done through the priorities that Yemenis will set. And sometimes we see things like, for example, the environmental priorities are very important for Yemenis. Also, economic violations are of major concern to Yemenis. In many cases, they are not seen or focused on. And all of these different ideas could lead to a roadmap or a strategy for transitional justice that we are working to develop through dialogue with others by opening channels for dialogue and communication. And we are trying to lead these efforts because this will help ensure that the discussion continues, so that at the moment when Yemenis implement this principle, when Yemenis come to implement these principles of justice and reconciliation, they will find references already there. And this will be necessary whether for their own knowledge, as guidance, and as well as for implementation. And so maintaining this discussion is very important. And I believe it's also important for Yemeni civil society organizations to always remember that coordination is what's important. And even if there is competition amongst them for this work, they would need to have coordination. Otherwise, it will be divide and conquer by all the various armed groups in the country. And secondly, other than coordination, remaining silent, that some of the families might resort to, might be understood. But for international organizations to behave in the same way, for local organizations to behave in the same way, this is unacceptable, because silence is what ensures that this kind of repression continues. Repression can only continue with silence. And so we need to always talk and remind people of these violations, and to remind them that people and their suffering cannot be taken lightly and cannot be forgotten, and that we need to take it into account. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maysa. This was a very interesting topic for us to discuss over the past hour, and this is obviously something that's painful for us to discuss as Yemenis and as people working on this file. I will now open the floor to questions. Thankfully, we can also have questions asked in person. We'll start with the question from someone had their hand raised. Samar Al-Umaisi, please go ahead. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Muhammad, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. I wanted to start by introducing myself. My name is Samar Al-Umaisi. I work in a humanitarian organization as well as a researcher in policies and development, working with international organizations in Geneva. I will speak as someone who has been affected by this violence against humanitarian workers. And I wanted to ask, how can the UN allow the Houthis to use us as a political bargaining chip? As you know, our work must be kept independent and neutral. It is in the humanitarian field, and it is not with or against any actor. And how long will this threat continue, especially for women working in this field? And as someone who's a student in a Western country, I think when I go back to Yemen, I will be seen as a spy, and my freedoms will be restricted. And so Samar, was this question to any specific panelists, or should we just leave it as an open question to all of the panelists? That could be an open question, but I also wanted to hear from Nico her opinion on this. Thank you very much, Samar.
طيب سنأخذ سؤال آخر.
We'll take another
هناك
question in
سؤال
this
من
round.
الأستاذ عبد
There's
الله
a
دكتور
question
عبد الله
from
شداد.
Abdullah Shaddad.
يقول ما هي الخطوات العملية
He's
التي
asking
يمكن
what are
القيام
some
بها من
practical
قبل
steps
منظمات
that can
المجتمع
be
المدني مع
implemented
المعتقلين
by civil society organizations
والمعتقلات
with the
منذ أكثر
detainees who
من
have been
شهرين.
detained for at least 2 months
طيب
at this
نعود
point.
إليك أستاذة نيكو.
So going back to
التي
Nico,
تفضلت به
we'll
سمر،
start with Samar's
ثم نأخذ
question,
سؤال آخر.
and then we'll take another question.
Sure. Thank you for your question, Samar. I hope that I can do it justice in responding because honestly, I think we all have questions about this, and I don't think it's clear. When you ask, how can the Houthis be using the UN as bargaining chips? I think they have become incredibly strong over the last few years and have not been held accountable for any of their violations. There has been no form of transitional justice to even be spoken about when they're doing these negotiations. And it's a set of negotiations that are just between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia with no question of, are you going to be held accountable for any of the violations that you've committed over the last few years, et cetera. And as this has been happening, as these negotiations have been happening, we're also seeing a world in which, of course, in which UN organizations are continuing to provide an immense amount of humanitarian aid to Houthi-controlled territories, despite the fact that Houthis have required incredibly, just not policies and restrictions on these organizations that should be against their mandates, that create a lack of independence, that create a situation in which organizations can't even oversee their own operations in a way that is actually independent and impartial. And the Houthis have been requiring these for years and only strengthening these requirements. And because humanitarian actors have seen the need in Yemen is so strong, they've continued to allow these restrictions to happen and in my opinion, have not pushed back enough. And so I don't in any way mean to minimize the massive humanitarian need that is in Yemen and to say that humanitarian aid is not necessary. When we're talking about a population where over 50% of the population does not have adequate food and water, I cannot in any way, be justified in saying that that is not of a huge importance for people to be grappling with. But I think simultaneously, what does humanitarian aid even mean in a context in which a party is controlling every single thing that organizations are doing, and they're using some of that humanitarian aid for their own goals? They're using it for recruiting children. That's been documented for years. They're using it to control, the population. They're giving it to their own fighters, et cetera. And they haven't even allowed humanitarian organizations to be doing adequate amounts of monitoring, evaluations, et cetera. So I think, to me, the problem obviously is first and foremost with the Houthis, and the blame lays with them. But at the same time, I think there's a lot more action that could have been taken by the international community and should have been taken over the last few years if they were going to continue operating in this area, if they were going to continue donating money. And right now, it's incredibly critical for these states to be asking themselves, what are we doing at this point? Are we going to just continue along as usual and continue providing all of this aid as our workers are being detained and blamed for being spies? Or are we going to actually take a stronger action than we have in the past when we're seeing that what we're doing is not working?
شكرا نيكو.
Thank you very much, Nico. Dr. Al-Ubaid, we're very honored to have him here. And his hand was raised. Are you still here, Dr. Al-Ubaid? Yes, I am.
السلام عليكم.
Everyone,
السلام الجميع.
I wanted to say hi to all of the panelists and attendees, and thank you, Mohammed, for your facilitation. I wanted to start with, I'm very happy to see Mahdi today, and I'm very happy to see that he's doing well, and I hope that all of our colleagues, especially those in Sana'a, are doing well, because honestly, I don't even know what to say at this point with what's been happening with regards to the failure in responding to it. But Mohammed, I had 2 points. The first is on the issue of reconciliation and justice. I wanted to remind everyone that there is a third actor, a third party that we always neglect to remember, and this is one of the problems of transitional justice in Yemen will be that I think maybe even more than 50% maybe of the severe violations were carried out by the coalition, and so the Houthis and the coalition might be the actors most
في مسألة التعاطي مع العدالة الانتقالية.
most interested
وده
in
بيعطينا
transitional
شوية
justice not being
فرصة
implemented. And I
يعني
think this gives us a bit
to
of
reflect
food
on
for
this
thought,
at
and I
some
think we need to
point
reflect on this,
طوال الزمن
on
يعني.
who these
النقطة
perpetrators
الثانية
actually are and what their positions might be on it. My second point,
محمد والأخوة الحاضرين، إنه يعني أنا كموظف سابق في الأمم المتحدة
as a former employee of the United
ما
Nations,
مستغرب للي
I'm
حصل
not surprised
بالنسبة
at all with the
للمعتقلين
response, especially with
وبالنسبة
regards to the
للصمت
detainees and the silence that
للأسباب
we've
الآتية،
seen.
لسببين رئيسيين.
And I think that's for two main reasons. I think first, the Houthis,
أصبحت سهلة جدا
for the Houthis, it has
إنه
become
كيفية
very
التعاطي
easy
مع منظمات
on
الأمم
how to
المتحدة
deal with
وكيفية
international
الحكم
organizations and
يعني
UN
أنا بقول لك
agencies and
إنه
how
أنا
to
قبل ما أطلع
force
من
them to
اليمن
fall in line. Before I left Yemen,
كنا تعرضنا لضغوط كثيرة
I was under a lot of pressure
لتوظيف
to
ناس
hire
ممولين للحوثيين.
individuals who were affiliated with the Houthis. And
تمت هذه الأشياء
unfortunately,
وأنا موجود
this
بالنسبة
was
للقطاع
done
بتاع الأمن في الأمم المتحدة.
especially with regards to the
ناس كثير مرة واحد
security
تم تعيين
sector
أربعة
within the United States. I remember one time 4 employees were hired because of pressure from the
بالإضافة
Houthis.
لأنه
And so that point, in addition to
يتناصروا
the fact that the
الموظفين
Houthis
المحليين
also have or pressure
بشير
the
مع
local
الاشتباه
employees.
بأنه في
And I thank Mahdi
نوعين
for
من
his
التعامل
uh,
من الأمم المتحدة إنها هي
and there have
تهتم
been
أكثر بالموظفين الدوليين
Mahdi mentioned 2 points. The first, that the United
يمكن
Nations is more
الموظفين
focused on
المحليين
international
وبالتالي
organizations
الموظف المحلي
and
يمكن
neglect
متعرض
local staff. And so
لاحتمال القبض
local employees are always
أو
at risk of being
التهديد
detained or of
بفقدان
being
الوظيفة
threatened
أو الأمان
of
الوظيفي
losing
إنه
their job.
ينتفي ويختفي. وبالتالي يمكن الرواية اللي بيقوم بها الحوثيين عادة يعني تتعاون
And so
معنا
what the
وتدينا
Houthis say,
معلومات ورينا إيش اللي بيحصل
the Houthis
داخل
always use this as
المنظمة
a way
وإلى
to
آخره.
cooperate with us and to work with us, and in
نضمن
exchange,
لك الاستمرار
will ensure
في
that you
الوظيفة.
can
فدي
continue on this
واحدة من
career
الإشكاليات
path or
الكبيرة
in the
اللي
job
خلينا
that you currently
الآن
hold. And that's one of the
وصلت
major
المهمة
problems
لأنه
that now
ما
has
عادت
gotten to the
المسألة
point
تهديد، المسألة
that it's
أصبحت
no
إنه
longer just one of
يعني
threatening these employees,
ضغط على
but
مستوى
actually
مستمر.
detaining them and
الثغرة الثانية
accusing them
بفتكر إنه
of
في
espionage.
تطور الأحداث
And also,
إنه
when we
كثير
look
من
at these
موظفين الأمم
developments,
المتحدة الدوليين
many
خاصة رؤوس
many
المنظمات
international
دائما هم
employees,
بيخافوا
especially
على
those managing
وظيفتهم
these
في دعم
organizations, I think
الحوثيين.
are more focused on their
بتذكر
own
أنا وأكون في
positions. I remember
صنعاء
the Houthis when I was
استخدموا
in
وسائل
Sana'a.
يمكن تكون حتى طفولية في إنه يقولوا لرئيس منظمة
The Houthis
الفلانية
would tell,
اسمع
for
لما
example, the head
تعمل
of a
كده ولا
certain
نحن
organization that either
نتعامل
you
معك
work with us
بشكل غير
or
مطلوب غير مرغوب فيه وبكده نحن
you'll be
نطلع يعني.
persona
دي
non
كانت
grata
بشكل إشكالية
in
كبيرة
Yemen, and you'll
جدا.
have to
المسألة
leave. And
الثانية
this
اللي هي
caused
كان
a
الحوثيين
significant
بيستخدموها
problem
ما
because they would have
زالوا
to stop their
كمنظمات
operations. And
هي
another thing the
مسألة
Houthis
الفيزا.
always did in
والله
organizations
أنا
is
أعطي لك
the
فيزا
issue
ولا
of the
ما أعطي لك
visa,
فيزا ولا
that
أنا
whether we
بدي
give you a
أسوي
visa
كذا
or
وكذا
not
وكذا وكذا. هذه
will
هي
depend on
أشياء
whether you
يمكن تكون مزعجة.
respond to certain demands
الموضوع
or
الثالث
not. And I think
والأخير
we
معقد
all know that.
شوية وهي المنظمة ما
Another
انتبهت
important
عليها وده
point,
حصل
and this is the
المكتب
organization or the entity
المفوضية.
that I worked with, and
المكتب
this was
المفوضية
the
له 3 أو 4
Human
سنين
Rights
يعني
Commission.
تعامل مع
For the past
الحوثيين
3 or 4
باستمرار
years,
وبصدور
this
مباشر
organization has
لدرجة
been
إنه
very
يعني
subservient
واحد من الموظفين
almost
بتاع
to the
السفارة هو
Houthis, to the
أصلا
point where one of
اعتبروه
the
هو موظف
employees of the American
في
embassy was detained
في المفوضية.
while he was
وأيضا
an
تركوا
employee at the
الموظفين بعض
UN
الضغوطات
Commission.
كثيرة جدا
And
من ضمنها
employees came
مدير
under a lot of pressure,
المكتب
including
نفسه
the
والمسؤولين
office
الدوليين
manager
مارسوا
and
ضغوط على الموظفين المحليين لدرجة
pressuring
إنه
local
في وقت من
employees to the
الأوقات قبل
extent
هذه
where
الانتقالات الأخيرة الموظفين
before
ما كانوا
this
عارفين الناس
wave
لا
of arrests,
إدارة مكتبهم ولا التعامل الحوثيين معهم.
the,
كانوا
the,
كثير
the,
منهم
the
يقولوا
employees
حاجات
were
هي
fully
لازم نلفت
preoccupied
لها
with dealing
النظر. أنا
with the Houthi
شخصيا
authorities without any support from their management. I think these are all
الآن
things that we
بفكر
need to take
جادي في
into
إنه
account. I'm thinking
نستعرض
seriously now
الأشياء
of
على مستوى عام
trying to
بحيث إنه
present
يكون في يعني
all of
يكون
these
في
matters
تعامل
publicly
معها
so that
جدي. لأنه بعتقد
they can be
إنه
dealt with in a more
يعني
serious way.
الحوثيين
Because I think that the Houthis
تمادوا، لكن في نفس الوقت زي ما
have
قلت المسألة بالنسبة لهم بقت سهلة جدا
gone
في تطبيق على الأمم
overboard, but I
المتحدة
think
وهم
it's
كل
also
مرة
become very easy for
بيزيدوا
them to ensure that the UN and UN
الانهيار.
agencies fall in line, and they
وأنا
only
بختلف معاك مهدي إنه الآن
escalate more
العالم
and
يمكن
more.
شبه نسى الحاصل في اليمن.
And I
يعني
think
بقول لك
the world
إنه
has, with all the
يعني
other things
مصالح ممكن
happening around the
تطلع
world,
غير
they've
هامة ولا
forgotten
حاجات،
what
لكن
happened. There
أنا ما
might be a
شايف أي
statement of
مصطبة
condemnation here or
منظمة
there, but there
على
hasn't been
أي
any
من
level of pressure on any of
من
the
الجهات الحوثية بأنه
Houthi
إطلاق سراح
entities
الناس
involved
أو
to secure
التعاطي
the
مع
release of these
الأمم المتحدة
individuals
بنوع من الجدية
or
أكثر.
to
شكرا.
deal more seriously with the United Nations and its agencies. Thank you. Muhammad's still muted.
الوقت ده. شكرا
Sorry
جزيلا
about that.
دكتور
Thank you very much, Dr.
للمداخلة
Al-Ubaid. Thank you for your
والملاحظة
intervention
يعني
and for your
ما
comments.
تم لك ولغيرك من العاملين وهذه الشفافية في أثناء عملك
And thank you for the transparency about your work in Yemen. So sorry, Mohammed, nothing was done to me. I haven't had a problem personally with this. I was an international staff and things were easy for me. But we need to focus on what happened to Yemenis. That's the biggest problem, what's happening to local staff and not what we as internationals want. Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Ubaid. Unfortunately, time is running out. We'll now take a question from Touran Al-Haddad.
أهلا.
Hello, everyone.
توران الحداد
My name is
من
Touran
اليمن،
Haddad
ناشط
from Yemen. I'm an
وباحث في المجال
activist
السياسي.
and researcher in
حقيقة
political
أود
affairs.
أن أنتهز إلى على
I had
باحثة ميساء
several
ونيكو
questions for Mesa and
Human Rights
Nico.
Watch. هو أن ما هي العدالة الانتقالية التي
My first question is, what is the form of transitional justice that we need in Yemen, or at least based on the perspective of the Sana Center and Human Rights Watch? What exactly will this process look like, and what kind of violations will be addressed by the process? And usually in transitional justice, whenever I attend any discussion of them, I see that there's a focus on just the Houthis. But we know that there are many violations committed by the Houthis, but there are also violations committed by others, including the internationally recognized government and the Arab coalition. And many actors have, or what the bombings, for example, carried out by Israel or the United States and the United Kingdom. And so if we're talking about human rights based on international law and international conventions, then I think there needs to be a broader perspective of that. Unfortunately, in Yemen, the violations... sorry, Touran, but if you could ask you, I think your question was... I'm sorry for interrupting you, but unfortunately, we don't have much time remaining. And so the question, we'll go back to Mesa with it by Touran Al-Haddad on the issue. What would this transitional justice process look like, and what is the transitional justice that is being adopted by the center, and why is there a lot of focus on the Houthis and not as much on other groups? Well, yes. So I think the transitional justice process is one that we all know. It's an issue of reparations, of documentation, of memorializing the victims, and also includes accountability and other preventative measures. There isn't any recipe for transitional justice that will work in any context. It's different from one country to another, from one conflict to another. But what's more important here is that transitional justice must not ignore the victims of the conflict who might become fuel for a future conflict if they feel like they were ignored and that their grievances and suffering were not dealt with properly. And also, as we know, if these kinds of these grievances continue, not only will they continue, but will only grow bigger. And so that's the objective of transitional justice, and in any context, it's designed in a way that is suitable for that context. And so that's something that Yemenis need to continue to discuss. And that's what I said earlier. We were encouraging and organizing these kinds of dialogues and discussions amongst Yemenis. With regards to the Houthis, we've spoken about the Houthis because our session today focuses primarily on the most recent wave of arrests that were carried out by the Houthis. The coalition has also carried out many violations, and the coalition uses a lot of international pressure to ensure that there is no form of accountability for these kinds of violations. We all know that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are countries that have excellent ties with actors in the international community, and this is one of the reasons why the violations that they committed in Yemen were being ignored. And now these violations the violations by international actors might actually increase if the US and UK strikes continue. And Israel, obviously, recently with the strike that they carried out against Hodeidah port, which is a port whose humanitarian importance to Yemenis we all know. And all of this was due from the very beginning to the
هو
lack of
نعم
accountability and to the
اليمنيين
neglect
مثل ما ذكرت
of
السابق
Yemenis and of
سابقا
victims. And
انه
like I've
كان
said
السبب
before,
ايضا انه حتى مكتب المبعوث الاممي في اليمن
one of the reasons for
وحالة
this was that the
فريدة
UN Special
في
Envoy's office
المنطقة
in
أو في
Yemen,
العالم
unlike
لا
other
يوجد
UN
فيه
Special Envoys
من
offices
يمثل حقوق
in the
الإنسان
region
أو
and the
يهتم
world, did
بهذا
not have
الملف
an
بينما
officer who's
هذا
responsible
حتى
for human
تحديد
rights and
متبع
transitional
بقية
justice, even
المكاتب
though
في
this
المبعوث
was
الأممي
a
في أي
practice that was carried out in other offices in other contexts.
شكرا
Thank you.
أستاذة ميساء.
Thank you very
معنا
much,
الدكتورة
Mesa.
أمة السلام الحاج
We had a question
وأعتقد لا
from
يمكن
Amat Salam
أن تكون
Al-Hajj,
ندوة عن
and I don't think
المعتقلين
we
دون
can have
أن نسمع
any
الدكتورة أمة
seminar
السلام.
on
تفضلي.
detainees without hearing from Amat
حياكم
Salam.
الله.
So over to you.
ندوة
Thank you very
ممتازة
much. I
وطرح
thank you for the seminar and for the
رائع
discussion.
جدا، ونسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يبارك فيكم جميعا،
And I hope
ونشكر
that Allah
الحرص معه
blesses
على
all of our
هذه
efforts. And I would like to thank Sana Center
الفعالية
for
وأيضا على
organizing and
جهود
facilitating
التنسيق
this session, as
الموجودة.
well as for their efforts to
كان طرحي
coordinate
فقط
all of these
إحنا
discussions.
لنا
My
من
comment was,
2016
since
معظم الموظفين
2016, as the
نشتغل
Abductees
ونسير
Mothers
لمتابعة
Association, we've been working on
الموظفين
this and trying to
وأهاليهم
follow up the
وذويهم،
cases of the detainees and their
يعني
families
كان في
and
صمت كبير
relatives. And we've
من
only been
الآخرين
faced by a
وتجاهل
lot of
كثير،
silence from
أو
many other
انشغلوا في
actors,
أشياء
or
يعني
them being busy with
تعطيهم
what they
الفرصة.
saw as other
ولكن
priorities,
الآن
if we want to
ومع
take it
هذه طرح
charitably.
هذه
But with the
طبعا
increase
الأخبار
with the
وانتهاكات
increase in the
وإصابة
detentions and the
أعمال
violations that were
العاملين في المنظمات،
and the violations that
لا بد إذا
affected
نحن
the
نعمل
employees of
بشكل
these
تشاركي
organizations, I think we all
وشكل
need to work
منظم
together
ونعين
and concert
بعضنا
our
البعض
efforts
كما
and to
ذكرت
support each other,
الأستاذة
just like Mesa was
ويحث
saying.
على ذلك نحن نفتح أيدينا
And I think that we all need
وقلوبنا إلى
to work
أن
together to coordinate our
نشترك مع
efforts
بعض
and to
في
open
العمل
our arms and
المشترك من
hearts
أجل
to
هؤلاء
work
المختطفين
all of us
والمهاجرين.
together
هذه
towards
النقطة الثانية
supporting these
على سبيل
detainees and their families. My
السؤال،
second
كيف
point was
ممكن
on
أن احنا نضغط على
how we
الأمم
can
المتحدة
pressure
أن
the
تفعل
United
دور المكتب
Nations
المبعوث بما يناسب
to
أو بما يحقق
operationalize the role of the
العمل
UN Special
المتميز
Envoy's
في
office
اليمن كباقي الدول. شكرا لكم.
so that it could keep up with what's being done on transitional
شكرا أستاذ أمة
justice
السلام
and
للمداخلة
accountability in other
والاختصار.
contexts. Thank you very much, Abat Salam, for your comments
معنا
and your
مجموعة من
question.
الأسئلة. أعتذر ممن لم
We also
أتمكن
have
من أخذ
several
أسئلتهم
other
لأن الوقت
questions.
انتهى، ولكن
Unfortunately,
هناك
time
مجموعة من
is up, and so we
الأسئلة
cannot take these
في
rounds. But there
المكتوبة
are
في الشات
some written
تدور
questions in the
حول
Q&A
ما هي
inbox,
الخطوات العملية، ما
and
الذي
there are a
يمكن
few
أن
of them that
نعمله
focus
في
on
منظمة
what
المجتمع
practical steps
المدني
can be
سواء
taken. What can civil
المحلية
society organizations
والإقليمية.
do, whether
هل
they are
ممكن أن
local
يطلع
or
الناس ما هي
regional or
الجهود
international?
التي تتم؟ هل يكون
Can
هناك
people, for
شفافية
example, be
لمعرفة ما الذي
informed of
يتم
what efforts are being
من التعاون
worked
لدعم المعتقلين
on to support these
وذويهم؟
detainees and to support their
سأترك
families?
المجال للمتحدثين
I'll
في حدود دقيقة
open the floor to the panelists. If you could
يعني
each
للإجابة أو
for a
للتعليق حول
minute
هذه الأسئلة
maybe
التي
comment
تدور
on these questions. The
حول
questions on what
الدور
practical
المطلوب وما
steps
يمكن
need to
أن
be
نعمله نحو
taken, what is the
الضحايا.
role that is required, and what can we do for the victims.
نبدأ من
Let's
تفضلوا.
start with
أستاذة هدى
whoever
تفضلي.
wants to start. Huda.
أولا يعني شكرا
Thank you.
للحضور على
Thank you.
الأسئلة
I would like to thank the
الهامة التي
attendees
طرحوها.
for their
بالتالي نحن
questions and their
دورنا
comments.
كمنظمات مجتمع مدني
Our
هو
role
دور
as civil
مهم
society
جدا
organizations is a
في
very
مسألة
important
رصد
one
وتوثيق انتهاكات
in
حقوق الإنسان.
documenting and
بالتالي
and
لولا
investigating
منظمات
human rights
المجتمع المدني
violations. And if it
وأعضاء
were not for
المجتمع
civil
المدني
society
والفاعلين
organizations,
مدافعي
civil
حقوق
society
الإنسان
actors and human
لما
rights
تم
defenders,
تسليط الضوء على ملف حقوق الإنسان
then
في
the human
المحاكم
rights file
الدولية في
in general in Yemen would not
النقاشات
have
على
been
وسائل
brought up
التواصل
in
الاجتماعي
many important
في
discussions
تسليط الضوء على مثل هذه
internationally on
الملفات في
social
العديد من
media and
التقارير
elsewhere.
الدولية.
And also the
وبالتالي
fact that there are
صحيح أن هناك
many reports.
العديد
It's
من
true that
منظمات
there
المجتمع
are
المدني
many
الفاعلة
civil
في اليمن
society
لكن
organizations
للأسف
that are very
هناك
active in
تنسيق
Yemen.
يعني
But
مشتت.
unfortunately, the problem is that
ولذا
is
ينبغي
the lack of coordination
التكاتف
and the fragmentation.
والتنسيق
And so there
في
needs to
الجهود بين
be
منظمات المجتمع
better
المدني في
coordination and a
كل
concerted effort
جغرافيا
between civil society
الجمهورية
organizations in all
اليمنية.
parts of the
أيضا
country,
مساندة المجتمع المدني
and also
المتواجد في مناطق
supporting
سيطرة
civil
الحوثيين،
society in the
خاصة
areas under
وأنه
the control of the
يعاني
Houthis,
الكثير من
especially
التضييق
because of the
للمساحات
pressure and
الحرية.
the restrictions that they
أيضا
are facing.
مسألة تشجيع ذوي
There's
المعتقلين
also the
وخاصة
issue of encouraging the
أهالي
families
المعتقلين
of the
للموظفين في الأمم
detainees,
المتحدة
especially
الذي تم
those who
اعتقالهم
have been detained,
مؤخرا
the
في
UN
مناطق
staff who
سيطرة
were
الحوثيين، أن
detained recently in the areas
التكتم
under the control
وعدم
of the Houthis.
التحدث
and telling them that remaining silent and believing the Houthis in their promises that it would be better for their detained relatives for them to remain silent, and that this is incorrect. I understand that there has been some incitement, and there have been threats of retribution. But what we fear is that these detainees, because of these false charges against them, being charged and convicted, and then we have illegitimate and illegal trials, and that is one of our fears. And so keeping silent and trying to keep a low profile will have a severe impact on the victims themselves. There's also the issue of, I think international organizations have a significant responsibility as well in threatening sanctions and threatening isolation of the Houthis. And I think that this is the only way to ensure the release of detained UN staff and detained civil society employees. And so not signing any roadmap or any agreement unless the Houthis commit to releasing these detainees. We also have a committee, the sanctions committee, and I think it's very important that it be communicated with regularly so that they are informed of the violations that are being carried, not just by the Houthis, but by all of the actors, because the issue of detentions and enforced disappearance has been carried out by all of the actors, but at varying levels. Also ensuring that in all of the rounds of negotiations or any peace agreement between the major parties, that the issue of releasing detainees be kept on that. And also taking a serious stance towards the violations that are being carried out against civilians. There need to be very serious and responsible steps taken to ensure that this issue is resolved. Also, maybe closing their offices in the areas under the control of the Houthis, because these detentions are an attempt to extort these international organizations. And so the threat, I think there need to be serious repercussions for the Houthis so that they stop these detentions and release these employees. Some of the detentions, for example, are facing increased threats and are at risk, and so there needs to be a serious and severe position taken by these organizations. Thank you very much, Huda. Mahdi, if we could conclude with you very briefly, if you will. Thank you very much. I think that the first responsibility is that the organizations whose employees have been detained need to live up to their moral and humanitarian responsibility. And we in civil society need to continue with these campaigns to advocate and also to create coalitions and alliances to continue to advocate for it and to never forget this disaster that civil society has gone through, that these people are now being stigmatized as being spies, despite the fact that they're working on providing humanitarian assistance. Thank you very much, Mahdi, and I would like to thank all of our attendees for their questions and their comments. I apologize to anyone who we have not been able to hear from or to take their questions. Please excuse us. It was due to the lack of time. I'd also like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank Maysa Shuja'uddin, Niku Jafarnia, Mahdi Belghaith, and Huda Sarari. I also wanted to thank our interpreter and the facilitators at the Sana'a Center for their efforts. Thank you all very much for your time and efforts. I hope that you benefited from this discussion, and see you next time. Goodbye.